He was on the verge of fulfilling a lifelong dream.
She was a substitute teacher, and she loved education.
She was a bubbly person looking forward to her future.
She was looking to settle down and have a family.
He appeared at just the right time.
He was somebody that was very sure of himself.
It was a whirlwind romance, and she was excited to see where the relationship could go.
But when the young teacher vanishes without a trace,
You already made a report last night?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, missing persons report.
everyone's a suspect.
Why did you guys end your relationship?
She was entertaining other dudes while she was with me.
The frantic search would uncover long-lost secrets.
She had 4 pets. One by one, they started dying.
Bizarre accusations.
There's an app that sets up young women with older men called sugar daddies.
And the revelation that sometimes old habits die hard.
He was like standing over her.
In the middle of the night?
Yeah.
He was standing next to your bed holding a samurai sword.
Yeah, it's very familiar to us.
If that's not crazy, I don't know what is.
I already know something is wrong. She's not okay, and it's because of him.
Friday, September 25th, 2020, Houston, Texas. As the work week winds down, all is quiet in the city's west side enclave of Memorial.
Houston is comprised of a lot of smaller towns and cities once you get outside of the kind of metro area. So Memorial is one of the areas heading out to the suburbs.
Memorial is especially affluent. You see a lot of high-dollar homes and apartments and things like that.
But as night falls on this peaceful suburb, a desperate 911 call comes in to local dispatchers.
Houston 911, do you need medical, police, or fire?
I'm at my daughter's house, and we need an officer to do a welfare check.
The caller says no one in the family has heard from her stepdaughter, 29-year-old Emma Shea Kirby, in 5 days.
Emmy's family contacted the apartment maintenance worker to let them into the apartment.
However, there is no sign of her inside.
No one has heard from her since Sunday. We've been trying to call her. She's not responding. She's not responding to messages.
They had no trace of her at all, and it's just really weird.
Okay, a police unit will be dispatched.
Emma Shea Emmy Kirby was small in size, but made a big impact on everyone she met.
Emma Shea was 4'9" and about 100 pounds, and she was definitely the light of the room.
She was very friendly, very outgoing, and just a very lovable person.
Emmy was a substitute teacher for the Katy ISD, which is the large independent school district out there in the Katy Memorial area.
Emma Shea loved working with children.
She also loved animals. She had 2 small dogs that she adopted, and she treated them like they were her babies.
But even though Emmy had her dogs to keep her company, she craved more companionship.
Emma Shea was 29. She was looking to settle down and have a family.
Hey, what brings you in today?
Just an oil change.
And when she met a 28-year-old mechanic named Javon Gilbert in the spring of 2019, she felt an immediate connection.
She took her car in to get serviced and ended up meeting Javon Gilbert. He was tall, dark, and handsome, which was her type.
Got any plans for later on?
Nope.
There was an exchange of phone numbers, and from there the relationship started.
He was somebody that was very sure of himself, and so this charismatic personality that he had is what won Emma Shea over.
She was excited to see where the relationship could go.
Within months, the flirtatious spark was firing on all cylinders.
It was a whirlwind romance, and she finally felt like she found a stable relationship.
She had introduced him to her family, and in December of 2019, in fact, they had vacationed in Cabo with her parents.
The family got to know Javon a little bit, and it just seemed like a match made in heaven.
Once they returned from their trip, the relationship continued to flourish.
Things just continued to go really fast in their relationship.
She was so in love with him.
They were basically living life to the fullest.
But in September of 2020, police have just arrived at Emma Shea Kirby's apartment, where it appears she has disappeared without a trace.
Emma Shea's family knew something was not right and got to the point where once they could not reach Emma Shea, they reached out to the police.
Emma Shea had such a supportive family. They all rallied together.
Houston Police, you want to step outside and talk?
Emma Shea's father and stepmother quickly relay their concerns to the responding officers.
It is completely abnormal. We get over here, we gain access to the apartment. The dogs are in there, which is completely unlike her. These dogs are like her babies.
When entry is made by the parents, they realize that there is a set of keys that is still within the apartment.
I found her keys clipped on the back of the door. All three of her apartment keys are there, but the door was locked.
But there's no sign that Emmy has been home anytime recently.
That's certainly concerning because we have apartment keys, but they can't locate her phone at that time. They also don't locate her purse within her apartment.
Yeah, that's really strange that she would take off like that.
They knew something was wrong. It just looked like she vanished.
For 29-year-old Emma Shea Kirby, the future looked extremely bright.
Emmy had been a pretty successful young woman. She comes from an affluent family.
She was a substitute teacher, and she was aspiring to become a full-time teacher.
And she had recently fallen in love.
She was in a committed relationship with a local mechanic named Javon Gilbert.
He was very supportive of her dreams. It appeared that he was just the perfect man for her.
But now, after being unable to reach Emmy for nearly a week, her family has shown up at her apartment in West Houston to discover some worrisome signs.
We didn't find her phone in the house,
Okay.
but it's going straight
To voicemail, so it's off, okay?
Yeah, it's not even ringing.
The family is very stressed out right now. They filed a missing persons report.
At this point, they're just trying to figure out where she is.
But hours later, as the sun rises over Houston, there's still no sign of Emma Shea.
Police came back over to the apartment the next day to follow up with Emma Shea's family.
Y'all already made a report last night?
Yeah, a missing persons report.
Emma Shea's parents tell police that they were able to locate her car in the light of day, but its location gave them pause.
It's parked in a completely different parking lot, a distance away.
Her parents pointed out to the police that her car was in a spot that didn't make any sense for it to be across the lot.
The family leads police to Emma Shea's vehicle.
It's at the backside of the building. This is the back of the building.
Yeah.
The keys found inside Emma Shea's apartment allow police easy access into her car.
They searched the car, but they really don't find anything.
When police ask if there's anyone else who might have access to Emma Shea's car or apartment, her family reveals she recently dated a man named Javon Gilbert.
Javon was staying over periodically, and that led to longer and longer stays, and he eventually moved in.
But Emma Shea's parents say the relationship had run its course.
They had recently broke up about 2 weeks ago.
They broke up.
The boyfriend and her.
He subsequently moved out.
Javon moved in with his father, and Emmy was moving into another apartment that was a little bit more affordable for her.
Emmy was in the process of packing up to move there on her own with her dogs.
Emmy's family goes on to explain they've been in contact with Javon over the past week regarding Emmy's whereabouts.
He had told her family he hadn't seen her, hadn't heard from her.
He didn't have a key, did he?
He's claiming that he doesn't have a key.
Okay.
After taking down Javon's contact information for their report, police take a closer look at the inside of Emma Shea's apartment.
Interestingly enough, there was no sign of forced entry at all. There wasn't any evidence of foul play.
There were a lot of items that appeared to be being packed in preparation for a move, which was expected. However, there were items such as furniture, couches, things like that that were in fact missing that wasn't expected at this point.
Without evidence of foul play, there's only so much police can do.
There was no obvious signs of her being in trouble at that time other than a grown woman not being at home.
Still, investigators want to help Emmy's family as much as possible.
Police actually went to Emmy's apartment management and they asked for footage to see what was going on outside of the apartment.
However, they immediately hit a roadblock.
I don't know how to use that.
Oh, okay.
My manager is usually the one who does it, and he's not here right now.
Okay. Well, we're not going to go nowhere with this.
Despite their best efforts, the missing persons team will need an official warrant to obtain the footage. And as the hours tick by, the search for Emma Shea intensifies.
Parties gather together and start working their own investigation, as family often do, in an attempt to assist law enforcement with finding Emma Shea.
As a mother, as a father, they're trying to do their very best to get the word out to the community in terms of, have you seen Emma Shea?
The family makes flyers and posters to put up around the neighborhood and hand out.
They also enlist the help of an organization called Texas EquiSearch.
Texas EquiSearch began in 2000 as a nonprofit volunteer search organization, and we search for missing people.
We have drones, ATVs, and then a group of foot searchers. Everyone puts in where they can to help out the families that need it in whatever way.
Meanwhile, missing persons investigators with Houston PD reach out to Emma Shea's ex-boyfriend, Javon Gilbert.
Police are typically going to speak to the significant other when there is a missing person because they're the person who is closest to the victim.
Hey, is this Javon?
Yeah.
Hey, how you doing, man? My name's Officer May. I'm with HPD Missing Persons Division. I saw your name in the report that you used to date Emmy Shea Kirby.
Yeah.
He does confirm that they had broken up and that he had moved back in with his family.
Javon indicates that he and Emmy were still friends and were still cordial despite the fact that they were recent exes.
The last time I seen her was on Friday night.
That would have been the 18th?
Yeah, we went out to eat.
Javon says he drove over to Emmy's place, and then they left together to get burgers.
And then what?
We went to her house.
So you guys are just chatting about whatever, you know, your relationship, whatnot?
No, we weren't even chatting about a relationship.
They went up to her apartment in a Netflixed and chilled, so they say.
He says Emmy was acting normal.
You guys were hanging out there Friday night. What time did you leave?
I left there around like 11 something, and I made it home about like 12 because I have to go to work the next morning.
Javon indicates he drove home by himself to his father's place and that was the last time he ever saw Emmy.
However, Javon says the last time he communicated with Emma Shea was on Sunday, the same day her family last heard from her.
Okay, so she texted you on Sunday, September 20th?
Yeah, she said she was busy cleaning up.
He last heard from her via text on that Sunday, and so they were kind of getting a timeline of her last movements.
Why did you guys end your relationship?
We ended our relationship because she was entertaining other dudes while she was with me.
Javon says he and Emmy broke up because he found out she was cheating on him after going through her phone.
She talked to these other dudes, just like chatting them up and flirting?
Well, a little bit more than that.
He reported that Emmy had been on an app on the internet that sets up young women with older men.
She was on this dating app. It's the Sugar Daddy app.
It was just red flag after red flag.
A week after Emma Shea Kirby was last seen, Houston police investigating the disappearance of the 29-year-old teacher are interviewing her ex-boyfriend, Javon Gilbert.
Emmy and Javon had just broken up about 2 weeks ago.
But according to him, they remained friends.
And now, Javon has just relayed a shocking new piece of information to investigators.
She was on this dating app. It's the Sugar Daddy app.
According to Javon, she continued to talk to other men from the Sugar Daddy websites, and that was a sore spot in the relationship.
It could be a situation where one of the men that she was allegedly talking to could have done something to her.
It was just red flag after red flag.
But that's not the only concerning information Javon reveals.
Javon indicated that Emmy was depressed a lot of the time and drinking heavily.
Like a big time drinker or just like a social drinker?
Nah, she's a heavy time drinker.
Javon said she was depressed and laying around a lot.
Since COVID started, she's just been at home, just watching YouTube. That's literally been her life. Like, she really didn't clean the house. I had to clean the house. Sometimes she really didn't even want to walk the dogs.
He's painting a picture of she was depressed and she possibly hurt herself, or her alcohol may have caused her to be missing and have something to do with this case.
So police have to investigate whether or not this is a legitimate claim.
All right, man. Well, hey, once again, I really appreciate your time.
All right.
At this point, police are looking at all the options.
Hoping to find out more, detectives start reaching out to Emmy's other loved ones. At the top of their list is her sister, Aaliyah.
The family said her sister and Emma Shea talked every day. And when she had not heard from Emma Shea, that's what sounded the alarm. That was something that was not normal.
She lived in Austin at the time. Aaliyah got to Houston as quick as she could and went to the station to help this investigation.
We want to talk about Emma Shea and your relationship with her.
Emma Shea is my older sister. We talk every day, multiple times a day. We would just video call each other, say what we had to say. I mean, sometimes like 5 times a day.
Emmy and Aaliyah were basically best friends as well as sisters.
She explains how odd, how weird it is that she hasn't talked to her sister in almost a week.
So when I would call her and she didn't even text me or call me back in a reasonable to me amount of time, I was already calling her friends hey, do you know what's going on? Because one day for someone else may not be a big deal, but for us, that was a big deal.
Investigators ask Aaliyah about Emmy's recent dating history, including anyone she may be talking to online.
Police ask Aaliyah if they had known of her to talk to any men from dating sites or Sugar Daddy websites, and Aaliyah says absolutely not, that this is not something that she would do.
That's when Aaliyah brings up someone who's already familiar to police, Javon Gilbert.
Aaliyah said she had some concerns about Javon.
Aaliyah says not long after Emma Shea and Javon started dating, the relationship took a downhill turn.
Javon ended up losing his job as a mechanic because, according to him, he was giving oil changes after hours, which Aaliyah thought was very suspicious.
And then him not truly working created some strain in the relationship too, because essentially she was taking care of everything.
Like the bills and rent. Yeah.
After it was obvious that Javon wasn't going to seek more employment, Emmy got kind of tired of that, and she basically kicked him out.
But Aaliyah says Javon wasn't willing to accept Emma Shea's new boundaries.
He would show up unannounced to places where she was. He would come to her apartment and look through her windows.
So she really begins to become concerned for her life because Javon is doing this stalking behavior.
And in mid-September, just a few weeks before Emma Shea went missing, the tense situation reached a tipping point.
Emma Shea was in her apartment asleep, and she felt like somebody was in her apartment.
She wakes up to find Javon standing over her holding a knife.
Houston detectives investigating the missing persons case of 29-year-old teacher Emma Shea Kirby have just learned that her ex, Javon Gilbert, had been stalking her in the weeks leading up to her disappearance.
Her sister had some concerns about Javon Gilbert, specifically dangerous behavior about breaking into Emma Shea's apartment, standing over her with a knife, and doing things that were making Emma Shea very, very fearful.
He's standing over her and she can't sleep. I'm like, wait, what? I was like, you need to call the cops or something, you know.
But to Aaliyah's dismay, her sister decided against involving the authorities at that time.
She's like, I don't know, sometimes it's hard because I don't like to just cut people off because I want to treat people how I would treat people. So she's still kind of like rationalizing.
However, Emma Shea did take other steps to try to protect herself from her ex.
She did contact her leasing office to inquire about the cost of ending the lease early.
I think that the timing is important because she is trying so desperately to get out of that apartment and to break the lease.
But now, Aaliyah is worried her sister didn't escape Javon's clutches soon enough.
I already know something is wrong. She's not okay, and it's because of him.
Aaliyah says even her last text messages with her sister now seem questionable.
She also explains to law enforcement how she recently got several texts from her sister's phone number, but those text messages were weird to her sister because they had emojis.
She didn't text you with emojis.
That wasn't the norm for her to put those.
Aaliyah told police that she thought that maybe those text messages were actually from Javon to make it look like she was alive and well.
After speaking with Aaliyah, detectives share her concerns about Javon. Is it possible everything he told police in his interview was an attempt to mislead them as well?
His story did not really line up with what Aaliyah said had happened, so they were interested in finding out a little bit more about this guy.
They run Javon's name through the database, and they discover that he is on probation and deferred adjudication for arson.
Although Emma Shea never filed any police reports against Javon, years earlier, another woman had.
Police see a protective order from a woman named Lily Chin, and they can also see that this is Javon's ex-wife.
Detectives immediately track down Lily Chen, and she agrees to speak with them about Javon.
We know that you had a real hard time with Javon. Can you tell us about y'all's relationship?
I met him in high school.
Okay.
She basically tells police that Javon was her high school sweetheart. You know, they eventually had a baby together, and things were good until they turned bad.
Lily says the first red flag she noticed was how Javon treated animals.
Lily tells investigators that when they moved in together, she had 4 pets. And so one by one, they started dying.
He killed a dog.
He killed the dog.
If that's not crazy, I don't know what is. If somebody can do that to an animal, Lord only knows what they could do to a person.
Then Javon's abusive behavior carried over to the couple's infant child.
Lily actually mentions that his daughter, when she would cry, there was abuse.
She was preemie, she does not cry. So he would put her in the closet. So I had to go grab the baby.
After the fiasco with the child endangerment, things just went downhill from there. She decided to move out.
That's why I moved out of the place and lived together.
Okay.
She was ready to start, fresh, and was very adamant about not providing Javon with the location as to where she was.
But before long, she realized Javon had figured out her new address.
I realized he started following me from my job. I saw him in the apartment complex.
Then one night, something even more terrifying happened while Lily was asleep in her new apartment.
I woke up like 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. I have a Japanese sword, the long one.
Yeah.
He was holding that next to my bed.
To detectives, the incident sounds eerily familiar.
They learn that he has done actions that are consistent with what they are seeing during their investigation with Emmy, specifically breaking into her home, holding in the ex-wife's case, a samurai sword compared to the knife, but consistent.
It's very familiar to us.
Really?
Yes.
You know, I was so scared. I said, you had to leave. I'm gonna call the police.
But for Lily, her waking nightmare wasn't over yet.
And he puts chloroform over her face, just like in the movies.
He kind of like covered my mouth. I just passed out. The next thing in the morning, I woke up.
Afterwards, Lily didn't hear from Javon for months. But he still wasn't done terrorizing her.
She was in her home asleep, and she was awoken out of her sleep by the smells of smoke.
So I was dreaming. I woke up, but I saw there was smoke just everywhere.
Her apartment was actually on fire.
Investigators in Houston, Texas now believe Javon Gilbert is behind the disappearance of his ex-girlfriend, Emma Shea Kirby.
They see a lot of the signs of abuse with Emma Shea that they're starting to hear about and learn happened with the ex-wife.
Javon's ex-wife Lily describes a harrowing tale of survival to investigators.
After not hearing from Javon for months, Lily woke up to smoke filling her apartment.
Her home was on fire, and there was not a way for her to exit the home safely.
When she looked out of the window, she saw her ex-husband, Javon Gilbert, in the parking lot.
That's why I called 911.
Help me, please. My ex set my apartment on fire.
You want to kill me?
Fortunately, emergency personnel were able to put out the blaze and get Lily and her daughter to safety.
Javon was arrested and charged with arson. They found a gas canister and lighter in his car that essentially confirmed he was responsible.
In 2015, Javon Gilbert pled guilty to arson. It's a first-degree felony which carries a range of punishment from 5 years in prison up to 99 years or life.
But because Javon didn't have any prior criminal convictions, he walked away with only probation.
The judge decided that an 8-year deferred adjudication was an appropriate sentence in this case.
It was around that same time that Javon met Emma Shea Kirby.
Emmy didn't know what he was capable of.
For detectives, it's now clear that Javon has a propensity for violence.
It's very clear that Javon wanted to control these women when he did not get his way in these romantic relationships, and when they were no longer willing to put up with some of his behaviors. Then at that point, it triggered him and sent him spiraling.
However, investigators will need more evidence to prove Javon was involved in Emma Shea's disappearance.
At this point, they still don't know where Emma Shea is.
But as search efforts continue, investigators finally get their hands on a crucial piece of evidence.
Police are finally able to secure the surveillance video from the apartment complex, and they are able to see Javon on the night of September 18th at Emma Shea's apartment.
Around 9 p.m., they see Javon leaving with Emmy.
They do leave in her car to go to dinner, as Javon had indicated in his original interview.
They arrive back at the apartment together 40 minutes later.
The couple returns to the apartment, park her car, and they walk in together.
Everything looks normal on the tape. It doesn't appear that they were arguing or fighting, and looks like everything is fine.
When Emma Shea and Javon Gilbert walk into the apartment, that's the last time Emma Shea is ever seen alive, is on that surveillance camera.
At that point, Javon's statement to police is no longer supported by the surveillance footage.
He tells investigators that he left Emma Shea at 11 o'clock p.m. However, cameras show Javon actually leaving Emma Shea's apartment at 1:40 a.m. And Emma Shea is not with him.
They see him there at 1:40 in the morning, carrying a somewhat large package out of the apartment.
He loads the large item into the back of Emmy's car and drives off.
Almost an hour later, Javon returns to the apartment complex in Emmy's car, parking it in the spot where her family later found it.
Investigators have to consider that what they just witnessed on the surveillance footage is Javon disposing of Emmy's body.
The surveillance footage shows Javon returning to Emmy's apartment several times over the following days.
They see him carrying the sofa to the dumpster and disposing of it.
Detectives now wonder, was there forensic evidence on that sofa?
Unfortunately, by the time Homicide is able to get the surveillance, the trash in that location had already been picked up, and we were unable to locate any items of interest for the investigation.
However, volunteers with Texas EquiSearch have not given up their hunt for Emma Shea.
We got really involved in the mission at that point.
And they are about to make a vital discovery during their search of a local park.
I believe we had about 23 people that showed up for the search. I was in the front, and a deer ran in front of me. And I thought, this is crazy, because who sees a deer in Houston?
As Sheila follows the deer's path, the hair on the back of her neck stands up.
I caught an odor and saw something that just didn't sit right with me. I was trying to figure out what it was I was seeing.
Tammy!
We knew we found her. God put those deers there for a reason.
After unearthing a shocking history of violence and abuse, Houston detectives are certain 28-year-old Javon Gilbert is behind the disappearance and suspected murder of his ex-girlfriend, Emma Shea Kirby.
Now they just need to find her body in order to finally arrest Javon.
And on October 3rd, more than 2 weeks since Emma Shea was last seen, volunteers with Texas EquiSearch make the tragic discovery in a local park.
I caught an odor and saw something that just didn't sit right with me.
Tammy!
We'd found human remains, and it was Emma Shea.
When the autopsy was performed on Emmy's body, the coroner found that she had been strangled.
During my experience, strangulation is a very personal attack.
But that's not Emmy's only injury.
She suffered a gunshot wound to the right side of her forehead.
On January 20th, 2021, police finally take Javon into custody.
The police arrest him. They get him down to the station. He agrees to talk to the police.
Obviously, you know what this is about, right?
Yep.
It's during that conversation that they're able to start confronting him with all of the information that they have.
We've gathered a lot of data. We've gathered a lot of surveillance video.
Still, Javon sticks to the same story he originally told police.
Javon states he left Emmy's house around 11 p.m. on September 18th.
He still wouldn't admit any type of involvement, and then they show him the video.
You want to see the video of the night of?
Yeah, we can do that too.
Clearly, Emmy is seen entering her apartment with Javon on the night of the 18th, but she never leaves. At least, not by her own will.
You're gonna see a guy walking out right here from her apartment. Sets this object down that he carried out, this big heavy object. Are you denying that this is you? You're just kind of sitting there like a bump on a log, so to speak. You gotta have something to say about it.
When they showed them the video of him taking a heavy object out of that apartment, he lawyered up, didn't want to talk to the police anymore.
I'm done. Huh? I'm done. You're done? You don't want to talk no more? Okay.
When he says that he wants a lawyer, that sort of sealed that investigators were on to what actually happened with Emma Shea Kirby.
At that point, law enforcement charged Javon Gilbert with the murder of Emma Shea Kirby. They also charged him with tampering with evidence for taking her body and moving it.
Because Javon is still on probation from the arson charge, prosecutors decide to take an unorthodox approach to his murder charge.
This was an unusual circumstance. The arson that he was on probation for and the murder that he was charged with carry the exact same range of punishment.
Despite all the evidence they have against Javon for Emma Shea's murder, it's only circumstantial. There's a risk that the jury could find him not guilty.
The prosecutor wanted to make sure that he wasn't going to get away. So it was like, okay, well, if we can get him on the arson charges, that automatically carries a sentence of life.
So we used the murder case as a triggering event to revoke his probation and move forward on that first.
Instead of taking Javon to trial, prosecutors file a motion to adjudicate guilt.
This isn't a jury trial. It's the judge listening to the evidence and having to determine have we proven the facts of the case such that he can find those allegations true and at that point revoke the probation.
Prosecutors tell the judge that Javon violated his probation in the most egregious way possible by murdering his ex-girlfriend, Emmy Kirby.
I think Javon Gilbert knew that Emma Shea was done with him. She wasn't giving him any more chances, and that's the most dangerous time in the life of an intimate partner victim.
Javon had finally realized that Emmy was done with him and that she didn't need him anymore, and she was really set to start a new life.
I think what made him snap is that he realized he no longer had control, and she stood up to him, and that made him really angry.
She was probably being brutally honest with him. He didn't want to hear it, so he strangled her to death.
But the violence didn't end there.
Prosecutors believe that Javon then shot her in the head just out of anger or spite.
After his rage subsided, Javon immediately began to try and cover up the crime.
He got rid of the evidence, which is primarily the couch, got her body, took it out, put it in a car, drove it to Bear Creek Park, dumped it, and went back to try to clean up the rest of the scene.
Prosecutors also believe Javon continued sending texts from Emmy's phone over the next few days to intentionally point investigators in the wrong direction.
Essentially, Javon had Emmy's phone and was texting himself and other people, trying to make it seem like Emmy was actually communicating and reaching out to family members.
The phone is never recovered, and there was never a gun that was recovered during this investigation.
He probably was just smart enough to know that if he discarded a gun, it couldn't be connected to him. And there are plenty of waterways and little creeks and stuff in that Bear Creek Park for plenty of opportunity to do that.
However, by the end of the hearing, the judge agrees that Javon is in violation of his probation.
Javon ultimately was sentenced to life in prison for arson.
I believe that the family was satisfied with the ultimate verdict and prioritizing the old arson case over the homicide case. And when we did end up with a life sentence, I thought they were happy with the result.
But what does this say about our court system that Javon was able to walk away free after the arson attempt against his ex-wife? If Javon had been put behind bars then, maybe he never would have been able to do what he did to Emmy.
When looking at intimate partner violence, when trying to escape these sort of relationships, the most critical time and the most dangerous time is when these folks are trying to escape. With Lily and with Emmy, they were both desperately trying to get away from this particular person.
I would encourage anybody that's in a relationship that there are the red flags. Separate yourself so you can get away from that person and continue with your life. You may save your own life by leaving that person.
April Tinsley was 9 years old when her life ended, but the investigation into her murder would continue long after the little girl in the photographs had become a memory preserved in the minds of her family, investigators, and an entire community. On April 1st, still 1988, in Fort Wayne, Indiana, April disappeared. She had been riding her bicycle near her home, an ordinary activity for a child her age, until something went terribly wrong. What began as a normal evening quickly became a desperate search. When April did not return home, concern spread through her family. A missing child meant urgency. Every minute mattered. Police and members of the community began searching for her, hoping that she would be found alive. Instead, the search ended with a discovery that transformed a missing person investigation into a murder case. April's body was found several days later in a rural area outside Fort Wayne. She had been killed. The news struck the community with enormous force. April was only 9 years old. Her disappearance had already frightened people, but the discovery of her body created an even darker question. Who could have taken a child from the area and killed her, then disappeared without leaving investigators a clear path to his identity? Detectives began examining every available piece of information. They had to reconstruct April's final movements, determine where she had been, identify anyone who might have seen her, and search for evidence that could reveal what happened. But there was no immediate breakthrough. The person responsible was not arrested. The investigation continued, but the passage of time began working against the detectives. Witness memories could fade. Leads could become impossible to verify. People moved. Circumstances changed. Yet April's name remained attached to the case. For her family, the passage of time did not make the loss small. For investigators, the case remained an unfinished responsibility. The murder became one of those investigations in which the victim could no longer speak, and the evidence had to speak for her. The years that followed were marked by uncertainty. April's killer remained unidentified, and the case gradually entered the category investigators know all too well: the cold case. But cold does not mean forgotten. Behind every cold case is a family that remembers, detectives who continue to wonder whether something was missed, and evidence waiting for a new opportunity. April's case would eventually prove exactly that. In the years after the murder, forensic science developed at a remarkable pace. DNA testing became increasingly powerful. Biological evidence that once could not provide a useful identification could later become a critical investigative tool. But in 1988, investigators did not have the modern capabilities that would eventually transform April's case. The biological evidence associated with the murder could be preserved, but its full potential would remain unknown. That distinction would become crucial decades later. A piece of evidence does not become more truthful because technology improves. Technology simply becomes better at reading what was already there. April's case would eventually depend on that principle. The investigation had begun with a child missing from her neighborhood. It had become a homicide investigation after her body was found. Then it became a decades-long search for an unknown killer. The original detectives could not know that their work would eventually become part of a forensic investigation spanning more than 30 years. They could not know that genetic genealogy would one day allow investigators to search through family connection. They could not know that the killer's identity could eventually be uncovered through DNA technology that had not yet become part of everyday police work. All they could do was follow the evidence available to them, and the evidence, however incomplete, was still there. April's murder remained an open wound in Fort Wayne. People who had known her grew older. Children who had been young when the murder occurred became adults. Detectives who had once worked the case eventually retired. But April herself remained forever 9 years old. Her photographs preserved the child she had been, while the investigation around her continued to age. The contrast was haunting. The calendar moved forward. The case seemed frozen. Then came new information. Years after April's murder, a man began sending disturbing messages that referenced the crime. These communications became part of the investigation and added a new layer of fear. Someone appeared to know details connected to April's murder, but knowing details and proving identity were two different things. Investigators still needed a connection that could withstand scrutiny. The case remained unresolved. The killer, whoever he was, had avoided identification for decades. The community had learned to live with the fact that an unknown murderer had once been among them. That is one of the most disturbing aspects of a long-running cold case. The suspect does not disappear into history simply because investigators lose the trail. He continues living somewhere. He has a name, a home, a routine. Perhaps people know him. Perhaps people pass him on the street without realizing what he may have done. The phrase, "monster next door," carries its power from precisely that fear, the possibility that evil can exist behind an ordinary face. For years, April's killer remained an invisible figure. Investigators had no name they could publicly attach to the crime. They had evidence, but not an identity. They had questions, but not answers. And then science began to change the balance. The development of forensic genealogy offered investigators a new way to examine unidentified DNA. Instead of requiring an exact match in a criminal database, investigators could look for relatives of the unknown person. A genetic connection could lead to a family. A family could lead to a genealogical investigation. A genealogical investigation could narrow the search to a particular individual. But none of this replaced traditional police work. Genetic genealogy could provide a lead, not a verdict. Investigators still had to confirm the identity through forensic testing and build the case carefully. April's investigation eventually reached that stage. The DNA evidence that had survived for decades became the starting point for a new search. The technology could now ask questions that investigators in 1988 could never have asked. Who was genetically connected to the unknown profile? What family line did it point toward? Could investigators identify the person whose DNA matched the evidence? The answers would eventually lead to an arrest in 2018, but before that moment arrived, April's case had to survive 30 years of silence. That silence was not empty. It was filled with police files, preserved evidence, unanswered questions, and the memory of a child whose family had never stopped wanting justice. April's murder had become more than a forgotten investigation. It had become a test of whether modern science could correct what time had failed to resolve. The case had begun in 1988 with a 9-year-old girl riding a bicycle. It would eventually become a landmark example of how genetic genealogy could breathe new life into a seemingly impossible investigation. But the technology could only work because the evidence had survived. Somewhere inside that evidence was information that the killer had left behind. He had not erased everything. He had not taken every trace with him. Time had hidden the truth, but it had not destroyed it. For 30 years, investigators waited for a way to read it, and in 2018, that opportunity finally arrived. For 30 years, April Tinsley's murder remained an open wound in Fort Wayne, a case that refused to disappear even as the original investigation grew older and the world around it changed. The little girl who had vanished in 1988 remained at the center of everything. Her photograph preserved the face of a 9-year-old who would never grow older, while detectives continued to confront the same unanswered question. Who had killed April? In the immediate aftermath of her disappearance, investigators had faced a terrifying race against time. April had been reported missing, and the search expanded through the area around Fort Wayne. Then came the discovery of her body in a rural area. The search for a missing child had become a homicide investigation, and detectives now had to reconstruct what had happened to her. Every detail mattered. Every possible witness had to be considered. Every piece of physical evidence had to be examined. But the investigation did not produce the immediate answer everyone wanted. There was no arrest that brought the case to a close. Instead, the unknown offender disappeared into the background of everyday life. The years that followed made the investigation increasingly difficult. People who had information might forget details. Witnesses might move away. Investigators changed. Technology changed. But the biological evidence associated with the crime remained important. What investigators could not fully exploit in 1988 might become valuable decades later. That possibility was one of the few reasons to keep hope alive. In cold case investigations, evidence can outlive the people who originally collected it. A sample can remain preserved while forensic science develops around it. A photograph can be re-examined. A statement can be compared with information discovered years later. A case can be reopened because something that was once impossible becomes possible. April's murder would eventually become an example of that process, but before the breakthrough, there was a long period when the case seemed trapped in the past. The killer had escaped identification. There was no courtroom, no conviction, no explanation for April's family. The community was left with the disturbing reality that a child had been murdered and the person responsible remained free. Years later, investigators received another disturbing element: messages connected to the case. The communications were chilling because they appeared to contain information related to April's murder. They suggested that someone knew details about the crime and was willing to communicate them. Such messages can create a powerful investigative lead, but they can also create confusion. A person can claim knowledge without being the killer. Investigators therefore needed something stronger than words. They needed evidence that could establish identity. The DNA evidence eventually became that evidence. For decades, traditional methods had failed to produce a definitive identification. Then forensic genealogy began changing the possibility. The technique allowed investigators to examine unidentified DNA through genetic relationships. Instead of asking whether the killer's exact profile existed in a criminal database, investigators could search for relatives who might have voluntarily placed genetic information into genealogy databases. The principle was straightforward but revolutionary. People inherit DNA from their parents and share portions of their genetic material with relatives. Even if the offender had never submitted his own DNA, a relative might have. That relative could become the first link in a chain leading back to the offender. Investigators working on April's case eventually used this approach. The unidentified DNA profile was not simply abandoned because it had failed to produce a direct match. It became the foundation for a new kind of search. Genetic genealogy researchers began looking for family connection. The process could be slow and complex. A distant genetic relative might be separated from the offender by several generations. Investigators had to reconstruct family trees, compare relationships, eliminate people who did not fit, and narrow the possibilities. The objective was not to accuse a family. It was to identify a potential individual whose DNA could then be tested independently. This distinction was critical. Genetic genealogy was a lead-generating tool, not a substitute for forensic confirmation. The case required investigators to combine modern genetics with old-fashioned detective work. Names had to be researched. Histories had to be examined. Ages and locations had to make sense. The final candidate had to be connected to the DNA evidence itself. Eventually, the investigation focused on a man named John D. Miller. He had lived in the Fort Wayne area and had connections that investigators considered relevant to the case. But even then, detectives did not simply announce that they had found the killer. They needed a direct DNA comparison. The genetic genealogy process had pointed toward a person. Now forensic science had to determine whether that person matched the biological evidence preserved from April's case. Investigators obtained a discarded item associated with Miller and used it to compare his DNA with the DNA recovered from evidence connected to April's murder. The result provided the breakthrough investigators had been waiting for. The DNA matched. After 30 years, the unknown biological profile had been connected to a specific individual. The case had moved from uncertainty to identification. In 2018, police arrested John D. Miller in connection with April Tinsley's murder. The arrest sent shock waves through Fort Wayne. For decades, April's killer had remained unidentified. Now there was a name, a face, and a suspect in custody. The phrase, "cold case solved," suddenly became reality, but the emotional impact extended far beyond the arrest itself. The case had remained unresolved for an entire generation. People who had been children when April was killed were adults by the time investigators finally announced the breakthrough. The investigation had outlived careers, technologies, and decades of public attention. The arrest demonstrated that the passage of time had not erased the evidence. It had simply taken 30 years for investigators to acquire the tools needed to interpret it. For April's family, the development carried a complicated mixture of emotions. The arrest could not bring April back. Nothing could, but it could answer the question that had haunted them since 1988. The person accused of killing April was no longer an invisible figure. Investigators had connected him to the biological evidence. The case had finally entered a new stage. The community, which had once been left wondering whether April's killer might still be somewhere nearby, now knew that investigators had identified a specific man. The long-running mystery had become a criminal prosecution. But the story did not end with the arrest. An arrest is not a conviction. The evidence would have to be presented in court. Investigators and prosecutors would have to establish the case beyond a reasonable doubt. The DNA evidence would become one of the central elements, but the broader investigation would also matter. The communications connected to the case, the history surrounding April's murder, and the circumstances of Miller's identification would all become part of the legal process. The breakthrough had solved the mystery of identity, but justice still required another step. Yet for the moment, one fact dominated the headlines. After 3 decades, investigators had finally named the man they believed was responsible for April Tinsley's death. The technology that had seemed almost unimaginable in 1988 had become the key to the case. Genetic genealogy had transformed an unidentified DNA profile into an investigative lead. Traditional detectives had followed that lead. Forensic scientists had confirmed it, and police had made the arrest. April's case had become a powerful demonstration of how old evidence can acquire new meaning. The DNA had been present for decades. The killer had not erased it. He had not been able to predict the future of forensic science. In 1988, the evidence had been a silent trace. In 2018, it became a name. The distance between those two moments was 30 years. 30 years of waiting, 30 years of unanswered questions, 30 years in which April's family carried a loss that never disappeared. Then, suddenly, the cold case was no longer cold. It had been reopened, reconstructed, and transformed by science. The unknown killer had a name. The suspect was under arrest. And the evidence that had survived since April's murder had finally begun telling the story investigators had been waiting decades to hear. The arrest of John D. Miller in 2018 changed the April Tinsley investigation in a matter of hours, but it did not erase the 30 years that had come before it. For investigators, the arrest was the result of a long chain of evidence that began with a child's disappearance in 1988 and survived through decades of technological change. For the public, however, the news was much simpler. After 30 years, the man police believed had murdered April Tinsley was finally in custody. That announcement carried enormous weight because the case had become one of Indiana's most enduring unsolved child murders. April had been 9 years old when she was killed. Her family had spent decades without knowing who was responsible. Now detectives had a suspect whose DNA was linked to biological evidence from the crime. The breakthrough had not come from a sudden confession or a witness who appeared after decades of silence. It had come from science. Genetic genealogy had helped investigators move from an unidentified DNA profile toward a specific family line and eventually toward Miller. But investigators still needed to prove the connection through direct forensic testing. That was the crucial transition from suspicion to evidence. Police obtained DNA associated with Miller from a discarded item and compared it with the biological evidence recovered during the original investigation. The result was a match. The unidentified DNA that had haunted the case for decades had finally been connected to a living person. Miller was arrested in July 2018. The arrest immediately transformed the case from a cold investigation into an active criminal prosecution. Yet the emotional impact of the development was impossible to separate from April herself. For years, her name had appeared in cold case files and anniversary stories. Her photograph remained a reminder of a childhood that had ended violently. The arrest did not change what had happened to her, but it changed the question surrounding her death. Investigators were no longer asking only who could have done it. They now had forensic evidence pointing to a particular man. The community could finally see the face behind a crime that had remained faceless for a generation. That was also what made the case so disturbing. Miller was not some mysterious figure who had appeared from nowhere. He had lived an ordinary life for decades while the investigation remained unresolved. The possibility that the person responsible had continued living while April's family waited was one of the most unsettling elements of the case. It demonstrated why cold cases can create a unique kind of fear. The offender may not remain visibly dangerous. He may become part of the ordinary world. He may have neighbors, acquaintances, routines, and a history that appears unrelated to the crime. The passage of time can create distance between the crime and the person who committed it, but DNA can collapse that distance in an instant. A biological trace from 1988 can suddenly connect a person living decades later to a crime seen from another era. That is precisely what happened in April's case. The forensic connection was especially important because the investigation had already endured so many years of uncertainty. Detectives could not rely solely on old memories. They needed evidence capable of surviving scrutiny. DNA provided that foundation. The genetic genealogy investigation had generated the lead, but the direct comparison provided the confirmation. The distinction was essential. Genetic genealogy did not itself prove that Miller committed the murder. It helped investigators find the person whose DNA needed to be tested. Once the direct comparison matched the crime scene profile, the investigation had a powerful piece of evidence linking Miller to the case. The technology represented a dramatic change from the tools available to investigators in 1988. Back then, forensic DNA analysis was still in its early development. Investigators could preserve biological material, but they did not have today's ability to use genetic information to construct distant family relationships. Decades later, investigators could use DNA not merely to compare one suspect with one crime scene, but to explore genetic connections across family trees. That ability fundamentally changed the possibilities for cold case investigation. April's case became one of the clearest examples of how the method could work. An unidentified offender profile did not have to remain unidentified forever. If the profile could be connected to relatives, the family network could provide a path toward the offender. But the breakthrough also depended on something far older than genetic genealogy: persistence. Someone had to preserve the evidence. Someone had to keep the case alive. Someone had to decide that an old investigation was worth revisiting. Someone had to examine the evidence with new technology rather than assuming that 30 years meant the case was finished. That persistence was essential. Without preserved evidence, modern science would have had nothing to analyze. Without investigators willing to revisit the case, the genetic information might never have been used. Without forensic confirmation, the genealogical lead would have remained only a lead. The arrest was therefore not the product of one technology alone. It was the final link in a chain that stretched across 3 decades. The original investigators had searched for April. Later, investigators had continued examining the case. Scientists had preserved and analyzed biological evidence. Genetic genealogy researchers had reconstructed family relationships. Detectives had followed those relationships to a specific person. Forensic testing had then provided the direct connection. Each stage depended on the one before it. The case also carried a painful reminder of how much time had been lost. When April was murdered, she was 9 years old. By the time Miller was arrested, she would have been nearly 4. The little girl who had once ridden her bicycle through Fort Wayne had been frozen forever in 1988, while the rest of the world moved forward. Her friends, family members, investigators, and community members aged. Technology transformed. Generations changed. But April's story remained anchored to that terrible spring of 1988. The arrest finally allowed the case to move beyond that frozen moment. It did not restore the years April never had. It did not remove the grief carried by her family, but it gave the investigation something it had lacked for 30 years: a defendant. The next stage would have to take place in court. Evidence that had been hidden in laboratory files would become evidence presented to a judge and jury. The genetic genealogy breakthrough would have to be explained. The DNA comparison would have to be established. Prosecutors would have to demonstrate how the evidence connected Miller to April's murder. The defense would have its opportunity to challenge the evidence and the state's case. The arrest was therefore not the end of the investigation. It was the beginning of the legal process that would determine what happened next. But even before that process unfolded, the arrest had already answered one of the questions that had haunted Fort Wayne for decades. April's killer was no longer an unknown person. Investigators had identified him. The phrase cold case had suddenly acquired a new meaning. The case was still old, but it was no longer dormant. It was active again. Detectives were examining evidence. Prosecutors were preparing charges. The public was learning details that had remained buried for decades. And April's family was finally seeing movement in a case that had seemed almost impossible to solve. The technology behind the breakthrough also attracted attention far beyond Indiana. Genetic genealogy had already begun transforming investigations in other jurisdictions, and April Tinsley's case demonstrated how powerful the approach could be when combined with preserved forensic evidence. The idea was simple enough to understand, but extraordinary in its consequences. A criminal could avoid giving police his DNA, but he could not necessarily control the DNA of his relatives. If enough genetic information existed in genealogy databases, investigators could potentially reconstruct a family network and follow it toward an unknown offender. The method turned ancestry into an investigative pathway. It did not mean every cold case could be solved. It did not guarantee an identification, but in cases where biological evidence existed and conventional searches had failed, it opened a door that had previously been locked. April's case was one of those cases. The biological evidence had been waiting since 1988. 30 years later, investigators finally had the tools to make it speak. Yet behind the technology was still the same human story. A 9-year-old girl had been killed. Her family had been left with grief and uncertainty. A community had lived for decades, knowing that someone responsible had never been held accountable. The arrest could not change the past. It could only change the future of the case. Now there would be hearings. Evidence would be examined. Prosecutors would present their argument. The defense would respond. A court would ultimately determine Miller's legal responsibility, but outside the courtroom, another judgment had already taken shape in the public mind. The unknown killer who had haunted April's case for 30 years now had a name. The mystery had a face. The biological evidence had found its target, and the case that once seemed destined to remain unresolved had finally begun moving toward an answer. For April's family, the significance of that moment could never be measured simply by headline. 30 years of uncertainty cannot be erased by one arrest, but an arrest can end one particular kind of suffering, the endless question of whether the killer will ever be found. For decades, that question had no answer. In 2018, it did. The investigation had traveled from a bicycle ride in Fort Wayne to a rural crime scene, from an unidentified DNA profile to genetic genealogy, from family connections to forensic confirmation, and finally to a police arrest. The journey had taken 30 years, but the evidence had survived every one of them. And now, for the first time since 1988, April Tinsley's murder was no longer only a cold case. It was a case with a suspect standing before the justice system, carrying with him the biological evidence that investigators had waited decades to connect to a name. The arrest of John D. Miller did not erase the years of uncertainty surrounding April Tinsley's murder. Instead, it forced investigators, prosecutors, and the public to confront a question that had remained unanswered since 1988. How had a killer managed to remain unidentified for so long, despite leaving behind evidence that would eventually expose him? April was 8 years old, not 9, when she was abducted on Good Friday in 1988. She was walking home from a friend's house in Fort Wayne, Indiana, when she disappeared. 3 days later, her body was discovered about 20 miles away in a rural area surrounded by farmland and Amish communities. The case immediately became one of the most disturbing child murders in the region. Detectives had to reconstruct April's final movements and determine who had taken her from the neighborhood. The evidence pointed to a violent sexual assault and murder, but identifying the offender proved far more difficult. The killer had vanished. There was no immediate suspect who could be taken into custody and no straightforward explanation for how April had been abducted. The investigation became a race between detectives and time was winning. Yet the offender eventually made a mistake that would keep the case alive. In 1990, 2 years after April's murder, a message appeared on a barn door near the location where her body had been found. The message claimed responsibility for killing April and threatened that the writer would kill again. It was an extraordinary development. The killer was no longer completely silent. Someone was deliberately inserting himself back into the investigation. The message suggested that the offender was still alive and potentially still capable of committing another crime. Investigators now had something more than the original crime scene. They had a communication that could potentially reveal the killer's personality, habits, and relationship to the case. But the message did not provide a name. It did not tell investigators where the offender lived. It did not reveal enough to identify him. Instead, it deepened the mystery. 16 years after April's murder, the killer appeared to communicate again. In 2004, 4 notes were left at residences around Fort Wayne. Several were placed on bicycles belonging to young girls. The notes were accompanied by used condoms or Polaroid photographs. Some of the communications referred directly to April. The behavior was deeply disturbing because it suggested that the person responsible for April's death was still watching the investigation and was willing to approach young girls' home. Investigators believe the same offender was responsible for the original murder and the later messages. The evidence gave them new material to examine. The Polaroid photographs became particularly important. One showed a distinctive green paisley-patterned bedspread. Investigators tried to determine where such a bedspread might have been found. They examined hotels, bedding suppliers, and other locations. They also searched for people who might have owned or borrowed Polaroid cameras. The investigation expanded. Detectives considered possible offenders in the Fort Wayne area and examined criminal histories for people who had committed offenses such as trespassing, indecent exposure, burglary, or voyeurism. The FBI eventually became heavily involved. In 2009, an FBI child abduction rapid deployment team joined Indiana authorities in an extensive review of the case. Investigators conducted new interviews, revisited neighborhoods, examined old information, and collected DNA samples from potential suspects. The effort generated new leads, but none produced the identification investigators needed. The case remained open. The evidence was growing, but the killer remained hidden. What made the case particularly frustrating was that investigators knew the offender had left behind forensic evidence. The FBI described the case as highly solvable because the killer had provided biological and other evidence over the years. But having evidence and being able to identify the person who left it were two very different things. In the years before genetic genealogy transformed cold case investigations, investigators largely depended on conventional DNA comparison. If the offender's DNA did not match a profile already available to law enforcement, the evidence could remain unidentified. A perfect forensic profile could exist without producing a name. That was the situation in April's case. The evidence could tell investigators that the same man was connected to the crime and later communications, but it could not immediately tell them who he was. Then the science changed. Genetic genealogy introduced a new possibility. Investigators could take an unidentified DNA profile and search for relatives in genealogical databases. The objective was not to find the killer directly. It was to find a genetic pathway toward him. A relative might unknowingly provide the first connection. From there, investigators could construct family trees, identify possible branches, and narrow the search. The method required patience and traditional detective work. A genetic relationship did not mean guilt. It simply created a lead. Investigators still had to identify a specific individual and obtain independent forensic confirmation. In April's case, that process eventually led detectives toward John D. Miller. The investigation then moved into a crucial phase. The question was no longer whether a family connection existed. The question was whether Miller's DNA matched the biological evidence associated with April's murder. Investigators obtained DNA from a discarded item connected to Miller. The comparison produced the result they had been seeking for 3 decades. The DNA matched the profile associated with the April Tinsley case. Suddenly, the unidentified killer had a name. Miller was arrested in July 2018. The news shocked the Fort Wayne community because the case had remained unresolved for an entire generation. People who had been children when April was murdered were now adults. Detectives who had worked the original investigation had spent much of their careers wondering whether the killer would ever be identified. The arrest finally answered that question. But the case had another important dimension. The breakthrough did not come from a single dramatic clue discovered in 2018. It came from evidence that had survived since the original crime and from investigators willing to keep searching for new ways to interpret it. The biological evidence had been there. The technology had not. Once genetic genealogy became available, investigators could approach the evidence from a completely different direction. The old DNA profile became the foundation for a new investigation. The family connections provided a path. Traditional detectives narrowed the possibilities. Forensic testing confirmed the connection. The final result was an arrest. That sequence demonstrated why cold cases can remain solvable even after decades. Time can destroy memories, but it cannot necessarily destroy biological evidence. A witness may forget what he saw. A suspect may move. A neighborhood may change. But DNA can remain preserved. When forensic science advances, an old sample can suddenly become more valuable than it was when it was collected. April's case became a striking example of that principle. Yet even after Miller was arrested, investigators still faced the responsibility of proving the case in court. An arrest is an accusation, not a conviction. The prosecution would need to present evidence demonstrating Miller's connection to April's murder. The DNA evidence was central, but prosecutors also had to establish the circumstances surrounding the crime and explain the investigative path that had led to Miller. The defense would have the opportunity to challenge the evidence and the prosecution's conclusions. The arrest, therefore, marked a beginning rather than an ending. But outside the courtroom, the significance of the moment was undeniable. After 30 years, the question of who had been responsible for April's murder had finally moved from uncertainty to a specific individual. The killer, who had once written messages claiming responsibility, had spent decades beyond the reach of investigators. He had apparently believed that time would protect him. Instead, time became one of the reasons he was eventually identified. Science had advanced. Investigative databases had expanded. Genetic genealogy had created a new path, and the biological evidence left behind in the original investigation had remained available for comparison. The case also revealed the disturbing persistence of the offender. The 1990 barn door message and the 2004 notes demonstrated that the person responsible had not simply disappeared after April's murder. He had returned to the case through written communications and photographs, creating additional evidence that investigators could later examine. In some ways, the killer had helped preserve the trail that would eventually lead to him. Every message created another piece of behavioral evidence. Every photograph provided another clue. Every biological trace increased the possibility that modern forensic science would eventually connect him to the crime. For years, those pieces did not form a complete picture. Then genetic genealogy supplied the missing link. The case had been a puzzle with one critical piece missing, the offender's identity. Once that piece was found, the rest of the evidence could be connected. The transformation was extraordinary. In 1988, April was a missing child. Days later, she was a murder victim. In 1990, the killer appeared to taunt investigators. In 2004, more messages suggested that he remained nearby. In 2009, federal and local investigators conducted a major renewed effort. And in 2018, the biological evidence finally pointed directly toward John D. Miller. 30 years had passed, but the investigation had never completely died. It had simply waited for a method capable of unlocking what the evidence contained. April's family had waited even longer for the truth. Nothing about the arrest could undo the loss of a child, but it could finally answer the question that had followed them for decades. The person responsible was no longer an anonymous figure. He had been identified through evidence that had survived since April's final days. And after 3 decades of silence, the case had finally begun speaking with a name. The name John D. Miller changed the April Tinsley investigation, but the evidence that led investigators to him had been building for years, scattered across a case that refused to disappear. For decades, detectives had been forced to work backward, trying to reconstruct a crime that had happened in 1988 while the person responsible remained outside their reach. The most important question was no longer whether April had been murdered. That had been established long ago. The question was whether the evidence could finally identify the man who had taken her life. By 2018, the answer was beginning to emerge through a combination of forensic science, investigative persistence, and genetic genealogy. But to understand why the breakthrough was so powerful, investigators had to look at everything that had happened after April's death, including the disturbing communications that appeared to come from the killer himself. 2 years after April was murdered, a message appeared on a barn door near where her body had been found. The message claimed responsibility for her killing and threatened another murder. It was not the behavior of someone trying to disappear completely. It was a deliberate act of communication. The writer wanted investigators to see the message. He wanted the case to remain alive, but he did not provide the one thing detectives needed most: his identity. The message became another piece of the puzzle. It demonstrated that someone connected to April's murder was still willing to interact with the investigation. For investigators, that created both an opportunity and a danger. The communication could contain information about the offender, but it could also be designed to mislead. Detectives had to treat every detail carefully. Years later, in 2004, the case became active again when several notes were left around Fort Wayne. Some were placed on bicycles belonging to young girls. Used condoms and Polaroid photographs accompanied the messages. The material was deeply disturbing. The notes referenced April and appeared to come from the same person responsible for the earlier communication. The investigation now had a pattern. The killer had not simply committed the original crime and vanished. He had continued to demonstrate an interest in young girls and had repeatedly inserted himself into the investigation. That behavior created additional evidence, but it also intensified the fear within the community. Parents were confronted with the possibility that the person responsible for April's murder could still be nearby. A case that had begun with the disappearance of one child had become a continuing threat in the public imagination. Investigators responded by revisiting potential suspects and searching for connections between the communications and people who had lived in the area. The distinctive Polaroid photographs became especially interesting. One photograph showed a green paisley-patterned bedspread. Detectives attempted to identify where such a bedspread might have been found. They explored hotels and other possible locations. They examined information about Polaroid camera. They searched for people whose backgrounds might connect them to the messages. But the investigation remained frustratingly incomplete. The evidence suggested the offender was real and still connected to the area, but no conventional investigation could conclusively identify him. The FBI eventually became involved in a renewed effort. In 2009, investigators conducted a major review of the case and pursued new leads. They interviewed people again. They revisited information from the original investigation. They collected DNA samples from potential suspects. The case was not forgotten. It was being actively re-examined, but even with federal assistance, the killer remained unidentified. This was the fundamental problem of the case. Investigators had DNA, but they did not have a matching identity. Traditional law enforcement databases could only help if the offender or a close enough relative had already provided a profile. If the person had never been arrested or had never entered a database, the profile could remain anonymous. The evidence could be scientifically precise and still practically useless for identification. That limitation would eventually disappear with genetic genealogy. The technology changed the question investigators could ask. Instead of asking, "Does this DNA match someone already known to law enforcement?" they could ask, "Does this DNA share enough genetic material with anyone in a genealogical database to reveal a family connection?" That was a completely different approach. It did not require the offender to have been arrested before. It did not require him to have voluntarily submitted his own DNA to police. A relative could provide the connection. The process began with the unidentified forensic profile. Researchers searched for genetic relatives and began constructing family trees. This work could involve distant relationships and enormous amounts of genealogical information. Names had to be traced through generations. Family branches had to be examined. People who could not fit the known circumstances had to be eliminated. The process was investigative, not automatic. Eventually, the search produced a promising path toward John D. Miller. Miller had lived in the Fort Wayne area, making the genealogical lead more significant. But investigators still had to confirm that the man identified through the genetic trail was the same man whose biological material had been recovered from. Evidence related to April's murder. That required direct DNA testing. Investigators obtained a discarded item associated with Miller. From it, they obtained DNA and compared the profile with the forensic evidence from April's case. The comparison produced a match. After 3 decades, the unidentified DNA had become an identity. The result was the moment the investigation had been waiting for since 1988. John D. Miller was arrested in July 2018. The arrest immediately transformed the case. The person investigators had been searching for was no longer an unknown figure. He was a named suspect, and the evidence connecting him to the crime could now be tested through the justice system. The public reaction was intense. A murder that had once seemed destined to remain unsolved had suddenly been cracked through technology that did not exist when April was killed. The case became an example of the growing power of genetic genealogy in criminal investigations, but the science was only part of the story. The breakthrough also demonstrated the importance of preserving evidence. If the biological material had been lost or contaminated, no amount of technological progress could have produced the same result. The evidence had to survive first. Then investigators had to recognize its potential. Then technology had to advance far enough to exploit it. The timing had finally aligned. The murder occurred in 1988. The first known killer communication appeared in 1990. More communications emerged in 2004. A major renewed investigation followed in 2009. Genetic genealogy eventually provided the investigative breakthrough, and by 2018, Miller was under arrest. The case had crossed multiple generations of investigative science. What investigators could not do in 1988 became possible in 2018. The difference was not that the evidence had changed. The difference was that the tools had changed. The arrest also forced investigators to revisit the years when the killer had apparently been living freely. The phrase, "monster next door," became especially disturbing because Miller had not been a mythical figure hiding in some unknown place. He had lived an ordinary life while the case remained unresolved. That contrast between ordinary appearance and alleged criminal responsibility is one of the most unsettling elements of cold cases. A person can exist in a community without drawing attention while carrying a secret that investigators may not discover for decades. But forensic evidence does not depend on appearances. DNA does not care whether a suspect seems ordinary. It can establish a biological connection that human perception. In April's case, that biological connection ultimately became the foundation for the arrest, yet the arrest itself was not the end of the legal process. Prosecutors would still have to prove their case. Miller would have legal representation. Evidence would be examined. The state would have to demonstrate that the DNA connection and other evidence established his responsibility for April's murder. The defense would have an opportunity to challenge the prosecution's evidence. The courtroom would become the next stage of the investigation. For April's family, the arrival of that stage represented a profound change. For 30 years, there had been no defendant. There had been no courtroom confrontation with the person accused of killing April. There had only been a question now. The justice system finally had a person to place at the center of the case. That did not make the pain disappear. It could not. But it provided something the family had not had since 1988, the possibility of accountability. The arrest also gave investigators an opportunity to examine whether Miller could be connected to the later messages and other evidence that had accumulated over the years. The case was no longer simply about an unidentified DNA profile. It was now about how the various pieces of evidence fit together. The messages, the photographs, the original crime, the biological evidence, the genetic genealogy, the discarded item. Each piece had a different role. Some established behavior, some created investigative leads, some provided forensic identification. Together, they created a narrative that investigators could bring into court. The case had taken 30 years to reach this point. Yet the final step had happened with remarkable speed once the genetic lead produced a candidate. That is one of the defining characteristics of modern cold case breakthrough. A case can remain stagnant for decades, then move rapidly once the right piece of information appears. The difficult part is finding the piece. In April's case, that piece was genetic genealogy. It transformed an unknown DNA profile into a family connection and then into a specific individual. But behind that breakthrough remained the same reality that had existed since April disappeared. A child had been killed, a family had been devastated, and an entire community had spent decades waiting for an answer. The arrest could not return the years that had been lost. It could only establish that the investigation had finally reached the person police believed was responsible. The case had survived 30 years of silence. Now it was entering the courtroom, and for the first time, the evidence collected after April's death would have the opportunity to tell its story before a judge and jury. The courtroom became the next battlefield in the April Tinsley investigation because an arrest could answer one question, but not the legal questions that followed. After 30 years, investigators had identified John Miller through DNA evidence and genetic genealogy, but the justice system required more than an identification. It required proof. The case that had begun with the disappearance of a little girl in Fort Wayne in 1988 was now moving through a legal process in which evidence collected decades earlier would be examined under modern standards. For April's family, this stage carried an emotional weight that was difficult to measure. They had spent years wondering whether anyone would ever be held accountable. Now, the man investigators believed was responsible was facing the consequences of the evidence that had survived since the night April disappeared. The central forensic evidence remained DNA. That evidence had been present in the case for decades, but its importance had changed dramatically as technology developed. In the early years, investigators knew that biological evidence existed, but they could not use genetic genealogy to identify a distant relative. By 2018, the same biological profile could become the starting point for a family search. That search eventually led investigators to Miller. The process demonstrated the difference between an investigative lead and forensic proof. Genetic genealogy helped investigators determine where to look. The direct DNA comparison helped establish the biological connection. Investigators had obtained DNA from a discarded item associated with Miller and compared it with the forensic profile connected to April's murder. The profiles matched. That result became one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the case, but the courtroom would have to consider the evidence as part of the larger investigation. The prosecution's responsibility was not simply to tell the story of a 30-year search. It was to establish Miller's guilt through admissible evidence. The defense, meanwhile, had the right to challenge the state's conclusions and scrutinize how the evidence had been collected, interpreted, and connected to the defendant. This adversarial process was essential, particularly in a case where the central scientific breakthrough had occurred decades after the crime. The court had to determine whether the evidence established responsibility beyond a reasonable doubt. The case also carried the extraordinary history of the killer's communication. In 1990, a message had appeared on a barn near the location where April's body was found, claiming responsibility for her murder and threatening another killer. Years later, in 2004, additional notes appeared around Fort Wayne. Some were placed on bicycles belonging to young girls, and the communications included disturbing objects and Polaroid photographs. Investigators believe these communications were connected to April's killer. They had spent years trying to determine who was behind them. Those messages were important because they showed that the offender had apparently continued to insert himself into the case long after April's murder. He had not simply disappeared. He had created additional evidence that investigators could examine. The photographs and notes provided behavioral clues, but the DNA provided something different, a scientific connection between the offender and the crime. Together, the evidence created a much stronger investigative picture. The arrest itself had been the culmination of that combination. Genetic genealogy created a pathway. Traditional investigation identified a person who fit the circumstances. Forensic testing then confirmed the connection. The case demonstrated how modern cold case investigations rarely depend on one piece of evidence alone. Instead, different types of information can reinforce one another. A genealogical relationship can narrow the search. A location can support the plausibility of a suspect. A behavioral pattern can provide context, and DNA can provide the critical biological link. April's case had all of those elements accumulated over time. The legal process, therefore, became an opportunity to place decades of investigative work into one coherent evidentiary framework. For the family, the court proceedings also represented a shift in the meaning of the case. For 30 years, April's murder had been a mystery. Now it was an accusation against a specific person. The question was no longer simply whether the killer would ever be identified. It was whether the evidence would lead to a conviction. That transition can be difficult for families because a long-awaited arrest creates expectations. After years of waiting, there can be a powerful desire for finality. But the legal system must proceed carefully. The passage of time does not lower the burden of proof. Even in a case involving overwhelming public interest, prosecutors must establish the facts through evidence. The defendant remains entitled to due process. That principle is especially important in a case whose original investigation lasted decades and involved numerous theories and leads. The eventual identification had to be stronger than suspicion. It had to be supported by forensic evidence. The DNA comparison provided precisely that kind of evidence. It was not based on a witness remembering a face from 30 years earlier. It did not depend on a fading memory. It did not rely on a rumor circulating through the community. It was biological evidence connecting Miller to the forensic profile associated with April's murder. The scientific development behind that evidence also became part of the larger significance of the case. Genetic genealogy had changed the landscape of cold case investigation. Before its widespread use, an unidentified DNA profile could remain unidentified indefinitely if no direct match existed in law enforcement databases. Investigators might know that the DNA came from the perpetrator, but have no practical method for determining his name. Genetic genealogy offered another route. A relative could become the bridge between an unknown profile and an unknown family. That bridge could lead investigators to a person who had never previously appeared in the case. April's investigation demonstrated the power of that approach, but it also highlighted the need for confirmation. A genealogical lead could never replace direct forensic evidence. The final identification depended on the DNA comparison with Miller. That distinction became one of the most important lessons from the investigation. Science can narrow a search, but investigators still have to establish the fact. The case also showed why evidence preservation matters so much. When April was killed, investigators could not know what future technology might accomplish. They could only collect and preserve what they believed might be useful. Decades later, that material became the key to identifying the offender. Without preserved biological evidence, genetic genealogy would have had nothing to analyze. The case, therefore, connected to very different eras of forensic investigation. The first began in 1988, when detectives worked with the technology of the time. The second arrived in 2018, when investigators could use genetic genealogy and advanced DNA analysis. The evidence remained essentially the bridge between those eras. April's case also became a story about persistence. Cold cases can exhaust investigators because there may be long periods when nothing appears to change. Detectives can spend years pursuing leads that produce no result. Families can wait for phone calls that never come. Public attention fades. Other cases become headline. Yet the absence of an immediate breakthrough does not necessarily mean the evidence is useless. Sometimes the investigation simply needs a different question. For decades, investigators asked whether April's killer could be matched to an existing suspect. Eventually, they asked whether the killer's DNA could reveal his relatives. That new question produced a new path. The path eventually led to Miller, and once the direct DNA comparison confirmed the connection, the case moved rapidly toward prosecution. The story was therefore not simply about technology. It was about changing the way investigators thought about evidence. A cold case can remain unsolved because the information is incomplete, but it can also remain unsolved because investigators do not yet have the tools to interpret what they possess. The distinction is crucial. April's case had biological evidence. What it lacked was the ability to turn that evidence into a name. Genetic genealogy provided that missing capability. The arrest of Miller became a landmark moment because it demonstrated how a decades-old case could suddenly become solvable when technology and evidence converged. But the emotional center of the investigation remained April. She had been 8 years old when she disappeared. She never had the chance to become an adult, build a career, create a family, or experience the ordinary milestones of life. Her family had been forced to imagine all of those possibilities without her. The legal process could never give them those years back. What it could potentially provide was accountability. After 3 decades, the person police accused of killing April was finally being required to answer through the justice system. The case that had once seemed frozen in 1988 had moved into a courtroom in a new century. The technology was different. The investigators were different. The world was different. But the evidence connected the two moments, and for April's family, the hope was that the final chapter would not be another unanswered question, but a definitive legal conclusion. The case against John D. Miller was no longer an abstract cold case investigation. After his arrest in 2018, the evidence collected over 3 decades began to take on a new meaning. What investigators had once described as an unidentified biological profile now had a name attached to it. What had once been a mystery was becoming a prosecution, but the most powerful part of the story remained the same evidence that had been waiting since April Tinsley's murder in 1988. The DNA had not changed. The science had. That difference would become one of the defining lessons of the case. April was 8 years old when she disappeared in Fort Wayne, Indiana, on Good Friday in 1988. Her body was found 3 days later in a rural area about 20 miles away. The discovery transformed the community's fear into grief and forced detectives into a homicide investigation that would ultimately last for decades. The original investigators faced the limitations of their era. Modern genetic genealogy did not exist. DNA technology was far less developed. Detectives had to depend heavily on physical evidence, interviews, witness information, and traditional investigative methods. The killer remained unidentified. Then, years later, he appeared to reach back into the investigation himself. In 1990, a message was discovered on a barn door near the location where April's body had been found. The message claimed responsibility for her murder and threatened another killing. It was a chilling development because it suggested that the offender was still present somewhere in the community and was deliberately reminding investigators that he had not been caught. The communication gave detectives another clue, but not the one they needed most. There was still no name. In 2004, additional communications appeared around Fort Wayne. Notes were left at residences, including on bicycles belonging to young girls. Used condoms and Polaroid photographs accompanied some of the messages. Several of the communications referenced April. Investigators believed they were connected to the same offender. The case now contained a disturbing pattern spanning years. The killer had apparently continued to monitor the investigation and communicate with the community. Yet despite the new evidence, investigators still could not identify him. One of the Polaroid photographs showed a green paisley-patterned bedspread, leading investigators to explore possible locations where such a bedspread might have appeared. They considered hotels and other places, trying to connect the photograph to a person or location. Detectives also examined criminal histories and sought people who might have committed offenses consistent with the behavior reflected in the messages. The FBI eventually joined the renewed effort. In 2009, federal investigators worked with local authorities to conduct an extensive review of the case. New interviews were conducted. Old information was revisited. DNA samples were collected from possible suspects. Investigators were searching for a connection that could finally turn the evidence into an identity. But the case remained unresolved. The biological profile still did not produce a direct match in conventional law enforcement databases. This was the central obstacle. The evidence could tell investigators that the killer had left biological material behind, but it could not tell them his name. Then genetic genealogy changed the possibility. Investigators could use the unidentified DNA profile to search for relatives through genealogical databases. Instead of requiring the offender himself to be present in a law enforcement database, the method could potentially identify someone through family relationships. The process was painstaking. Researchers examined genetic matches, built family trees, traced relatives across generations, and narrowed the possibilities. The genetic information was not treated as proof of guilt. It was treated as an investigative lead. Eventually, the investigation pointed toward John D. Miller. Miller became a person of interest because his background and location were consistent with the developing investigation. But detectives needed more than a genealogical connection. They needed direct forensic confirmation. Investigators obtained DNA from a discarded item associated with Miller. That DNA was compared with the biological evidence from April's case. The result was a match. The discovery transformed the investigation. The unidentified DNA profile that had remained unresolved for 30 years now corresponded to a specific individual. Miller was arrested in July 2018. For investigators who had spent years working the case, the arrest represented the moment when decades of uncertainty finally collapsed into one concrete fact. The person whose DNA matched the evidence had been identified. For the community, the arrest was equally shocking. The case had become part of Fort Wayne's history. Generations had grown up knowing April's name. Her murder had been discussed as an example of a case that might never be solved. Now the person investigators believed was responsible was in custody, but an arrest was only the beginning of the legal process. Prosecutors had to establish the case in court. The DNA evidence had to be explained. The genetic genealogy process had to be placed into context. The investigators had to demonstrate how the evidence led from an unidentified profile to Miller. The defense would have the opportunity to challenge the prosecution's case. The burden of proof remained with the state. That process was especially important because the case had already demonstrated the dangers of uncertainty. Investigators had spent decades without an answer, and the justice system could not simply declare that the mystery was solved because technology had produced a suspect. The evidence had to be tested in court. The DNA match became central because it provided a direct connection between Miller and the biological evidence associated with April's murder. The genetic genealogy process was important because it explained how investigators found Miller, but the direct comparison was what established the forensic link. This distinction would become increasingly important as genetic genealogy spread into other criminal investigations. The technique was powerful, but it was not a shortcut around traditional standards of proof. It could identify where investigators should look. It could not by itself establish guilt. The April Tinsley investigation showed the complete process. First, investigators preserved biological evidence. Decades later, forensic scientists obtained an unidentified DNA profile. Genetic genealogy generated a family connection. Detectives narrowed that connection to Miller. A discarded item provided a sample. The laboratory comparison produced a match. The police then made an arrest. Each stage depended on the previous one. Without the original evidence, there would have been no DNA profile. Without the DNA profile, there would have been no genetic genealogy. Without the genealogical lead, investigators might never have focused on Miller. Without the discarded item, they could not have confirmed the match. The breakthrough was therefore the result of an entire investigative chain stretching across 30 years, but the emotional dimension remained impossible to separate from the science. April's family had spent decades living with the absence of a child who should have had an entire lifetime ahead of her. An arrest could not restore that future. It could not undo the murder. It could not erase the memories of 1988. What it could do was remove one terrible uncertainty. The person responsible was no longer unknown. For a family that had spent decades wondering whether the killer would ever be identified, that mattered. The arrest also changed the community's relationship with the case. For years, April's murder had carried the disturbing possibility that the killer might still be somewhere nearby. The later messages had intensified that fear. Now investigators had identified a man and taken him into custody. The mystery was becoming a legal case rather than an open-ended threat. That transition brought a different kind of tension. The public wanted answers. The family wanted justice. Investigators wanted the evidence to withstand scrutiny. Prosecutors wanted a conviction. And the defense was preparing to challenge the case. After 30 years, the investigation had finally reached the stage where evidence would be tested in open court. The case also raised broader questions about time and justice. How long can evidence survive? How long can a family wait? Can technology compensate for investigative limitations from an earlier era? The crime occurred before modern genetic genealogy existed. The killer remained unidentified through traditional investigative methods, yet the biological evidence survived long enough for a future generation to use it differently. The case became proof that a cold case can remain alive even when the investigation appears dormant. The evidence may be waiting for the right technology, the right database, or the right investigator to connect it to an answer. That is why April's case became so important to the evolution of forensic investigation. The breakthrough did not come because the killer suddenly confessed. It came because science changed the way investigators could search. The killer had left a biological signature behind in 1988. 30 years later, investigators finally had the tools to follow that signature through a family tree. And when they reached the end of that tree, they found a name: John D. Miller. The arrest was the moment when the cold case became an active criminal prosecution. But it was also the moment when April's story moved from an unanswered mystery toward accountability. For 30 years, her family had waited for the phone call that might never come. In 2018, it finally did. The case had a suspect. The DNA had a match. The investigation had a direction. And the question that had haunted Fort Wayne since 1988 was finally closer than ever to an answer. The courtroom was filled when John D. Miller finally stood before the justice system in the case that had haunted Fort Wayne for 30 years. On one side were investigators who had spent years trying to identify April Tinsley's killer. On the other was a family that had waited decades for an answer. Between them stood a man whose DNA had finally connected him to evidence recovered from the 1988 murder. But the most shocking development was still ahead. Miller had initially pleaded not guilty after his arrest in July 2018, setting the stage for a trial that could have forced the case through another lengthy legal battle. Then, in December, everything changed. Miller entered a guilty plea to murder and child molestation. The decision meant there would be no dramatic jury trial and no need for prosecutors to present every piece of evidence before a jury. Instead, the man investigators had spent 30 years searching for was admitting responsibility in court. According to reporting on the plea, Miller acknowledged that he had abducted April on April 1st, still 1988, sexually assaulted her, and strangled her. For the family, the words were devastating but also definitive. For 3 decades, April's final moments had been surrounded by uncertainty now. The person responsible was describing his role himself. The confession added another layer to the forensic evidence that had already broken the case open. DNA had identified Miller. His own statements now connected him to the crime. The investigation that had once depended on anonymous messages, old witness accounts, and an unidentified biological profile had reached a point where the accused was admitting guilt. It was an extraordinary reversal after 30 years of silence. The case had begun with April disappearing from her Fort Wayne neighborhood. She had been walking to a friend's house to retrieve an umbrella when she vanished. Her mother reported her missing when she did not come home. The search expanded quickly, with hundreds of police officers and volunteers looking for the child. 3 days later, April's body was discovered in a rural ditch roughly 20 miles from the neighborhood where she had disappeared. The investigation immediately became a murder case. Detectives had a crime scene, a victim, witnesses, and eventually biological evidence, but no identified killer. A composite sketch was created from a witness account describing a man believed to have forced a girl into a vehicle. Investigators followed leads and examined potential suspects. Yet the person responsible remained outside the reach of the investigation. Years passed. Then the offender appeared to communicate with authorities and the public. A message was left on a barn near the location where April's body had been found. Later, more notes appeared around Fort Wayne, some involving young girls and disturbing objects. Investigators believe the communications came from the same person responsible for April's murder. Each new message was both a threat and an investigative opportunity. The killer was leaving traces of himself, but he was also maintaining control over the investigation by deciding when and how he would appear. Detectives tried to identify him through conventional methods. They investigated possible suspects. They examined criminal histories. They searched for connections to the messages and photographs. They revisited old information. The FBI became involved in the renewed investigation. Still, the killer remained unidentified. The DNA evidence was there, but a conventional database search did not provide the answer. That changed when investigators turned to genetic genealogy. The DNA profile from the case was submitted for genealogical analysis, and researchers began searching for relatives. The process was unlike anything available to the original investigators. Instead of searching only for the offender himself, investigators could search through genetic relationships. The goal was to build a family tree and identify individuals who could potentially be connected to the unidentified profile. Eventually, the investigation narrowed toward two brothers. One of them was John D. Miller, then 59 years old and living in Grabille, Indiana. Detectives needed direct confirmation. They watched and investigated. They obtained discarded material from Miller's trash, including used condoms, and extracted DNA. The comparison produced the match that changed everything. Miller's DNA was consistent with the biological evidence connected to April's case. Investigators approached him on July 15, SIL 2018, and asked him to come to the police station. According to the police affidavit, when detectives asked whether he knew why they wanted to speak with him, Miller answered with April's name. That response was chilling because it suggested that he immediately understood the reason for the interview. During questioning, investigators obtained incriminating statements. Miller admitted involvement in April's abduction, assault, and killing. After 30 years, the mystery had finally been broken. But the legal process still had to continue. Miller was formally charged with murder and child molestation. He initially pleaded not guilty. The possibility of a trial remained. Prosecutors had the DNA evidence. They had the genealogical investigation. They had Miller's statements. They had the history of the case and the communications attributed to the offender. A trial could have forced all of those pieces into the open. Instead, Miller changed his plea. In December 2018, he pleaded guilty. The agreement called for an 80-year prison sentence. The courtroom now became the place where 3 decades of uncertainty finally reached a legal conclusion. When Miller was sentenced, the room was crowded. Family members attended. Investigators who had worked the original case were present. People who had spent years waiting for justice were finally watching the justice system deliver a punishment. Miller received 80 years in prison, with 50 years for murder and 30 years for child molestation. The sentence was the culmination of an investigation that had lasted longer than many criminal careers. Detectives who had worked on the case in 1988 had aged. Technology had transformed. The neighborhood where April disappeared had changed, but the evidence had remained. The DNA that had once been an anonymous biological trace had eventually become the key to a name. The genealogical search had provided the path. The discarded DNA sample had provided the confirmation. Miller's statements and guilty plea provided the legal resolution. The sequence demonstrated how dramatically cold case investigations had changed. In 1988, investigators could not have predicted that a genealogical database might one day help identify the killer. They could only collect and preserve evidence using the methods available to them. Decades later, another generation of investigators could take that same evidence and ask a completely different question. The breakthrough did not mean that every cold case could be solved. It meant that an unidentified DNA profile no longer necessarily had to remain unidentified. A family connection could create a lead where a traditional database had produced nothing. April's case became a landmark example of that possibility, yet the technology was never the entire story. The investigation also depended on persistence. Detectives kept the case alive. Evidence was preserved. Leads were revisited. New techniques were considered. When genetic genealogy became available, investigators were willing to use it. The result was an identification that had seemed impossible for 30 years. The emotional significance was even greater because April had been only 8 years old. Her life had ended before she had the opportunity to grow up. Her family had been forced to live with that absence while also carrying the unanswered question of who had taken her. For years, they had no defendant to confront and no courtroom in which to hear the accused acknowledge responsibility. The guilty plea changed that. It could not undo April's death. It could not restore the future she had lost, but it established accountability. The person responsible had been identified, arrested, prosecuted, and sentenced. The case had moved through every stage that investigators had once hoped to reach, and perhaps most importantly, April's name was no longer attached only to the phrase unsolved murder. The case had a conclusion. The cold case had been closed through evidence that had survived for 30 years. The DNA had done what investigators could not accomplish in 1988. It had connected an unknown offender to a family. The family connection led to a suspect. The suspect's DNA confirmed the forensic link. The arrest followed. Then came the confession, the guilty plea, and finally, the 80-year sentence. The chain was complete. But the most haunting detail remained the simplest. The evidence had been there all along. For 30 years, it had waited in silence. The killer had lived his life believing that the passage of time could protect him. Instead, time allowed science to catch up with him. The technology he could not have anticipated became the tool that exposed him. And on the day John Miller entered his guilty plea, the mystery that had begun with a missing 8-year-old girl finally had an answer. April Tinsley's killer was no longer a faceless stranger in an old case file. He was a convicted murderer serving an 80-year sentence. The investigation had taken 30 years, but the evidence had never forgotten. The guilty plea brought a legal conclusion to the murder of April Tinsley, but it could not erase the years that came before it. For 3 decades, April's name had been associated with an unanswered question. Who had taken her? Who had killed her? And why had the person responsible been able to remain unidentified for so long? The answers finally emerged through a combination of preserved evidence, persistent investigation, genetic genealogy, and the eventual confession of John D. But even after the courtroom delivered its sentence, the case continued to raise a larger and more disturbing question. How could a murder that had once seemed impossible to solve suddenly collapse under the weight of modern DNA technology? The answer began with the evidence collected after April disappeared in 1988. She was 8 years old when she left a friend's house in Fort Wayne, Indiana, on Good Friday, April 1st. She was supposed to return home after retrieving an umbrella. Instead, she disappeared. Her mother reported her missing, and a massive search began. Police officers, volunteers, and community members looked for the child. 3 days later, April's body was found in a rural area roughly 20 miles from where she had disappeared. The discovery ended the search, but began one of Indiana's most haunting homicide investigations. Detectives had to determine what had happened during the hours between April's disappearance and the discovery of her body. They collected evidence. They interviewed witnesses. They developed leads. They created a composite sketch based on information from a witness who reported seeing a man forcing a girl into a vehicle. Yet none of those efforts produced the identity investigators needed. The offender remained unknown. The case slowly became a cold case, but it never truly disappeared. The name April Tinsley remained in police files, newspaper reports, memories, and family conversations. Then, 2 years after the murder, the person investigators believed was responsible made a bizarre decision. A message was written on a barn door near the location where April's body had been found. The writer claimed responsibility for her death and threatened another murder. It was a chilling act because it suggested that the offender was still following the case. Instead of disappearing completely, he was deliberately communicating. Investigators had to wonder why. Was the message intended to frighten the community? Was the writer seeking attention? Was he trying to convince investigators that he was still watching? Or was it simply another expression of the same behavior that had led to April's murder? Whatever the motive, the message became part of the case. Then came another disturbing development. In 2004, more communications appeared around Fort Wayne. Notes were left at residences and on bicycles belonging to young girls. Used condoms and Polaroid photographs were included with some of the messages. The communications referred to April and suggested a connection to the original murder. Investigators believed they were dealing with the same offender. The case had now produced evidence stretching across 16 years. The killer had apparently not forgotten April. He had continued to communicate, leaving behind material that investigators could preserve and examine. One photograph showed a green paisley-patterned bedspread. Detectives investigated possible locations where that bedspread might have been found. They examined hotels and other places. They looked at Polaroid cameras and attempted to trace possible sources. They investigated people whose criminal histories or behavior might fit the evidence. Yet the offender continued to remain unidentified. The FBI eventually joined local authorities in a major renewed investigation. In 2009, investigators conducted an extensive review of the case. Old information was re-examined. New interviews were conducted. DNA samples were collected from potential suspects. Investigators were attempting to find the connection that earlier generations had missed. But traditional DNA searches still produced no definitive identification. The biological evidence existed, but the offender's profile did not match a known person in the relevant databases. This was the wall that investigators repeatedly hit. The DNA could identify the offender scientifically, but only if there was something to compare it against. Without a direct match, the profile remained anonymous. That changed with genetic genealogy. Investigators began using the unidentified DNA profile in a genealogical search. Instead of asking whether the offender was already known to law enforcement, they searched for relatives who shared portions of the genetic profile. A distant relative could potentially provide a path toward the offender. Researchers could then construct family trees and follow the branches. The process was complex. Genetic relationships had to be interpreted carefully. People had to be eliminated based on age, location, sex, and other known circumstances. Investigators had to avoid confusing a genetic relative with the actual offender. The objective was to find a person whose DNA could then be tested directly. Eventually, the investigation narrowed toward two brothers. One of those brothers was John D. Miller. Investigators had enough information to consider him a serious candidate, but they still needed direct forensic confirmation. Detectives collected discarded DNA associated with Miller. The comparison with the evidence from April's case produced the crucial match. The unidentified profile had found its identity. Miller was arrested on July 15, SIL 2018. The arrest was shocking because of the amount of time that had passed. 30 years had separated the crime from the moment police finally took the suspect into custody. For the public, the arrest demonstrated the power of modern forensic science. For investigators, it demonstrated the value of preserving evidence and refusing to abandon a case simply because conventional methods had failed. And for April's family, it meant something even more personal. The person accused of killing her had finally been found. But the investigation did not end at the moment of arrest. Detectives interviewed Miller, and he made statements implicating himself in April's abduction, assault, and killing. The evidence was now stronger than it had ever been. There was the original biological evidence. There was the genealogical pathway. There was the direct DNA match. There were Miller-esque statements. And there was the long history of communications that investigators believed had come from April's killer. The case was no longer a mystery without a suspect. It was a prosecution with multiple forms of evidence pointing in the same direction. Miller initially pleaded not guilty, leaving open the possibility of a trial, but the case never reached a jury. In December 2018, Miller pleaded guilty to murder and child molestation. The plea brought the decades-long investigation to a legal conclusion. He was sentenced to 80 years in prison, including 50 years for murder and 30 years for child molestation. The sentence represented the final stage of a case that had survived longer than many people expected. But even that finality could not completely resolve the emotional damage caused by April's death. Justice and healing are not the same thing. A conviction can establish responsibility. A sentence can impose punishment, but neither can restore the life that was taken. April would always remain 8 years old in the memory of those who knew her. The years she should have lived would never return. Her family would always carry the knowledge of what happened. The guilty plea could not change that. What it did change, the uncertainty. For 30 years, the family had lived without knowing who had killed April. The case had no definitive offender. There was no courtroom admission. There was no sentence. That uncertainty finally ended. The case also changed the understanding of what a cold case could become. In the past, an unsolved murder could remain unsolved indefinitely if detectives exhausted conventional leads. Once evidence went cold, investigators might have little reason to believe anything would change. Genetic genealogy challenged that assumption. A DNA profile that had remained unidentified for decades could become the starting point for a new investigation. The technique could reveal relatives, family trees, and previously invisible connections. The offender might never have submitted his own DNA to police, yet a relative could unknowingly provide the key. That was the extraordinary lesson of April's case. Miller did not have to walk into a police station and provide his DNA. He did not have to confess before investigators knew who he was. His genetic family connections created the path. The final DNA comparison then provided the confirmation. The case became a demonstration of how modern forensic investigation could reach backward through time. The technology of 2018 could unlock evidence collected in 1988. That connection between two different eras was perhaps the most remarkable part of the story. The original detectives could not have known how important the evidence would eventually become. They could only collect what they could find and preserve it. Their work created the foundation for investigators 30 years later. The newer investigators could then build on that foundation using tools the original detectives never had. The case therefore belonged to two generations of investigators. One generation searched for a killer using the methods of the late 20th century. Another generation used genetic genealogy to finish what the first generation could not. The evidence connected them. The story also carried a warning for criminals who believe that time is an ally. Time can weaken a case, but it can also strengthen the ability of investigators to analyze evidence. Technology rarely moves backward. DNA science became more sophisticated. Databases expanded. Genealogical research became more powerful. Investigative teams became more experienced in using these tools. An offender who escapes identification in one decade may face a completely different investigative landscape in the next. April's killer had remained unidentified for 30 years. Then the technology caught up with the evidence. The case also demonstrated the importance of persistent. Cold case investigations require investigators to return to old evidence with fresh eyes. They must be willing to reconsider assumptions and use tools that were unavailable when the crime occurred. April's case was not solved because someone discovered a magical clue overnight. It was solved because decades of evidence and investigative work eventually converged. The final breakthrough may have looked sudden, but the foundation had been built over 30 years. April's disappearance, the search, the discovery of her body, the original investigation, the 1990 message, the 2004 communications, the FBI review, the preserved DNA, the genetic genealogy, the family tree, the discarded sample, the DNA match, the arrest, the confession, the guilty plea, the sentence. Each event became another link in a chain that eventually reached the truth, and that truth was painful. April Tinsley was murdered in 1988. John D. Miller was identified and arrested 30 years later. He admitted his role and received an 80-year sentence. The mystery was over. But April's story remained more than the story of a cold case solved by DNA. It became a reminder that behind every forensic profile is a human life, and behind every case number is a family waiting for answers. Technology may identify a killer, but it cannot replace the years that were stolen. What it can do is ensure that evidence does not remain silent forever. In April's case, the evidence waited for 30 years. Then, finally, it spoke. The sentence imposed on John D. Miller brought a legal ending to a case that had begun with a terrifying disappearance 3 decades earlier. But the story of April Tinsley did not end when the courtroom doors closed. For investigators, the conviction represented the final confirmation that the long investigation had reached the right person. For April's family, however, justice could never be measured only in years behind bars. Nothing could return the child who disappeared in 1988. Nothing could restore the ordinary future that had been taken from her. What the investigation could provide was something that had been absent for 30 years. Certainty. April's name was no longer attached to an unidentified killer. The DNA evidence had identified the offender. Genetic genealogy had helped investigators find him. The direct forensic comparison had confirmed the connection. Miller had confessed, pleaded guilty, and received an 80-year sentence. The case that had once seemed almost impossible to solve had finally reached a conclusion. Yet the road to that conclusion revealed why cold cases can remain alive long after the headlines disappear. In April's case, the investigation survived because evidence survived. That principle is easy to overlook when a crime is decades old. People change, neighborhoods change, technology changes, witnesses age, memories fade, detectives retire, files move from one office to another, but physical evidence can remain exactly where investigators left it, waiting for a future that no one can predict. In 1988, the detectives working April's murder could not know that genetic genealogy would become one of the most powerful tools in American cold case investigation. They could not know that a DNA profile that failed to produce a conventional match might one day reveal a family network. They could not know that the evidence collected during their investigation would eventually be examined through technology that had not yet been developed. They could only do what investigators have always done: collect evidence, preserve it, document it, and hope that one day it would lead somewhere. For years, it did not. The case remained frustratingly unresolved. Then the investigative landscape changed. Genetic genealogy created an entirely new route toward identification. Instead of searching only for the offender, investigators could search for relatives. That distinction was revolutionary. A person who had never appeared in a criminal database could still have biological relatives whose DNA had entered a genealogy database for entirely different reasons. Family history, something people used to learn about their ancestors, could become an investigative pathway. That possibility transformed the April Tinsley case. The unidentified DNA profile was no longer trapped inside a conventional database search. It could be examined through relationships. Researchers could look for shared genetic segments. They could construct family trees. They could identify branches that might contain the unknown offender. But the process required extraordinary care. A genetic relative was not automatically a suspect. A family connection did not establish guilt. It merely created a direction for investigators to pursue. The investigators still had to determine who could realistically be connected to the crime. They had to consider age, location, family relationships, and the known facts surrounding April's murder. That process eventually brought John D. Miller into focus. The next step was crucial. Investigators needed a sample that could be compared directly with the forensic evidence. They obtained discarded DNA connected to Miller. The laboratory comparison produced the result that had eluded investigators for 3 decades. The DNA matched. The invisible biological trail had finally reached a name. Miller's arrest in July 2018 was therefore not simply the conclusion of a police investigation. It was the moment when 2 generations of forensic science collided. Evidence from 1988 met technology from the 21st century. The original investigators had gathered material without knowing exactly how future scientists might use it. Decades later, investigators were able to extract information from that material that had previously been beyond reach. The case became an example of why detectives continue to preserve evidence even when an investigation appears to have reached a dead end. A dead end in one era may become a starting point in another. That concept is central to cold case work. Investigators are not always searching for entirely new evidence. Sometimes they are searching for a new way to understand old evidence. April's case demonstrated that distinction with unusual clarity. The evidence had not suddenly appeared in 2018. It had been there for decades. What changed was the ability to connect it to a person. The communications associated with the case added another layer to the investigation. In 1990, a message appeared near the location where April's body had been found. Years later, additional notes and photographs appeared around Fort Wayne. Those communications had terrified the community and frustrated investigators. They also created a strange record of the offender's behavior. Someone connected to April's murder seemed determined to remind investigators that he was still present. The communications were disturbing because they suggested confidence. Whoever was behind them appeared to believe that he could communicate without revealing his identity. He could leave a message and disappear. He could create fear without exposing himself. For years, that confidence appeared justified. The killer remained unidentified. But every communication also created another piece of evidence. The offender could not know what future investigators might learn from the material he left behind. He could not know how forensic science would evolve. He could not know that investigators would eventually be able to use genetic relationships to identify him. The very evidence he left behind would become part of the history that ultimately surrounded his arrest. The story therefore contains an unsettling irony. The passage of time may have convinced the offender that the investigation was fading, but the investigation was not truly gone. It was waiting. Detectives continued to maintain the case. Federal investigators later became involved. Evidence remained available. New forensic techniques emerged, and eventually someone looked at the evidence from a different angle. That is often how cold cases are solved. There is rarely one cinematic moment in which an investigator suddenly discovers everything. More often, there is a long sequence of small developments that eventually converge. A preserved sample, a new database, a genealogical map, a family tree, a suspect, a discarded object, a laboratory comparison, a police interview, a confession, a guilty plea. Each event may appear ordinary by itself. Together, they can transform an impossible case into a solved one. April's case followed that pattern. The final breakthrough was dramatic, but the groundwork had been laid decades earlier. That reality also places the spotlight on the original investigators. When a cold case is solved decades later, the people who began the investigation may not receive the same attention as the technology that finally produced the identification. Yet their work remains essential. They searched for April. They documented the crime scene. They collected evidence. They pursued leads. They created records. They preserved information that future investigators would eventually need. Without that foundation, genetic genealogy would have had nothing to work with. The modern breakthrough was built on the persistence of the past. This is why cold case investigations are often described as investigations that never truly end. A detective may retire, a case may leave the daily workload, but evidence can remain active indefinitely. A DNA profile does not have an expiration date simply because investigators have run out of ideas. A case can wait for new technology, new databases, new investigators, or new information. April's murder waited 30 years. Then the tools changed. The result was extraordinary. A man who had remained outside the reach of investigators for an entire generation was identified through his genetic connection to relatives and then directly linked through DNA. The arrest was followed by an admission of responsibility. The guilty plea eliminated the uncertainty of a trial. The 80-year sentence established the legal consequence for the family. Those developments offered something they had been denied since 1988. The knowledge that the person responsible had been identified and punished. But there was another legacy. April's case became part of a much larger transformation in criminal investigation. Genetic genealogy began attracting enormous attention because it demonstrated that the limits of traditional DNA databases were not necessarily the limits of DNA itself. A forensic profile did not have to remain anonymous forever. The genetic information contained within it could reveal relationships that investigators could follow. That possibility opened new doors in cold cases across the United States. It also created important debates about privacy, consent, and the use of consumer genetic information in criminal investigation. The power of the technology came with questions that society had to confront. How should genealogical databases be used? What protections should exist for people who never intended their DNA to become part of a criminal investigation? How should investigators balance the public interest in solving violent crimes with individual privacy? Those questions became increasingly important as more cold cases were reopened. But in April's case, the technology had accomplished what investigators had been unable to accomplish through traditional methods. It had turned an unidentified biological profile into a suspect, and that suspect had ultimately admitted responsibility. The story remains haunting because of the length of time involved. 30 years separated April's murder from the arrest. For most people, 30 years represents an entire generation. Children become parents. Buildings disappear. New roads are built. Technology that once seemed futuristic becomes ordinary. Yet April remained frozen in the year she died. Her family continued carrying the same loss while the investigation moved through changing eras. The eventual breakthrough did not rewrite that history. It added an answer to it. And perhaps that is the most important distinction in any cold case. Solving the mystery does not erase the tragedy. It does not make the years disappear. It does not return the victim. It simply ensures that the truth is no longer buried with the unanswered questions. April's case began with a missing child and ended with a convicted murder. Between those 2 points were 30 years of uncertainty, investigation, technological change, and persistence. The evidence survived. The investigators continued. Science advanced, and eventually, the past caught up with the man who had believed he could remain hidden. For decades, April's killer had been a name nobody knew. Then DNA changed everything. The unknown became identified. The suspect became a defendant. The defendant became a convicted murderer, and the case that had once seemed destined to remain unresolved finally entered the history books as a cold case that science helped bring back to life. For 30 years, the murder of April Tinsley remained a wound that never truly closed. The case moved through different generations of detectives, different technologies, and different investigative theories, but the central fact never changed. An 8-year-old girl had been murdered, and the person responsible had escaped identification. Then, in 2018, genetic genealogy transformed the investigation. What had once been an anonymous DNA profile became a family connection, and that family connection eventually led investigators to John D. Miller. The direct DNA comparison confirmed the link. Miller was arrested. He later admitted his role in April's abduction, assault, and murder, pleaded guilty, and received an 80-year sentence. The legal outcome was definitive, but the path toward that outcome revealed something larger about the nature of cold cases. They are not always cases without evidence. Sometimes they are cases with evidence that investigators cannot yet interpret. April's murder was one of those cases. The original investigation had produced biological evidence, but the technology available at the time could not turn that evidence into an identity. The profile remained unidentified. Years became decades. The evidence stayed in the background while investigators continued searching for other answers. The offender appeared to have escaped, yet the DNA never forgot. It remained a silent biological signature tied to the crime. That signature would eventually become the key to the entire investigation. The breakthrough began when investigators decided to approach the unidentified profile through genetic genealogy. The basic idea was revolutionary. Instead of searching only for a direct match in a law enforcement database, investigators could search for genetic relatives. A person who had never been arrested might have a cousin, distant relative, or other family member whose DNA was available through a genealogy database. That relative could become the first step toward identifying the unknown offender. But genetic genealogy was not a simple search engine. It required researchers to interpret genetic relationships and reconstruct family histories. A match might lead to one branch of a family tree, then another, then another. Investigators had to determine which branch could contain the offender. They had to consider geography, age, family structure, and other facts from the case. The process narrowed the field until John D. Miller emerged as a possible suspect. But investigators understood that a genealogical connection was not enough. They needed direct forensic evidence. That meant obtaining Miller's DNA without relying on a voluntary sample. Investigators followed him and collected discarded material. A DNA sample was recovered from his trash, and laboratory testing provided the confirmation. Miller's DNA matched the profile connected to April's murder. The result was extraordinary because the profile had remained unidentified for 30 years. A piece of biological evidence collected in the late 1980s had finally been linked to a living person in the modern era. The arrest followed on July 15th, SIL 2018. The investigation that had seemed frozen for decades suddenly moved forward. Miller was taken into custody and questioned. According to investigators, he admitted involvement in April's murder. The statements added a human voice to evidence that had previously been silent. For years, detectives had been trying to understand what happened to April. Now the man accused of killing her was describing his role. The case no longer depended entirely on reconstruction. The offender himself was acknowledging responsibility. Yet the investigation had not simply solved itself through DNA. The final result depended on a combination of persistence and technology. The original detectives had preserved the evidence. Later, investigators had reopened the case. Federal and local authorities had reviewed old leads. Genetic genealogists had examined the DNA. Detectives had traced the genealogical information to Miller. Forensic scientists had confirmed the match. Each group had performed a different part of the investigation. The breakthrough was the result of those efforts converging. That is one of the most important lessons from April's case. Cold case work is rarely a single dramatic discovery. It is often a chain of people, evidence, and decisions stretching across decades. One investigator collects evidence, another preserves it, another reviews it. A scientist develops a new technique. A genealogist finds a distant relative. A detective follows the family tree. A laboratory confirms the result. The final arrest may take place in one afternoon, but the investigation behind it can span an entire lifetime. April's case demonstrates that reality with unusual force. The original crime occurred before the internet had become part of everyday life, before smartphones, before social media, before consumer DNA testing became common. Investigators in 1988 were operating in a completely different world. Yet the evidence they collected survived into a future where investigators could use information in ways they could never have imagined. That is why preservation is so critical in forensic science. Investigators cannot always predict which piece of evidence will become important later. A biological sample may appear ordinary at the time. Decades later, it may contain the answer to a question that no one could solve before. The evidence from April's case became exactly that. It survived long enough for technology to catch up. The later communications from the offender also played an important role in keeping the case active. The 1990 message on the barn door was chilling because it showed that the killer was willing to insert himself into the investigation. He claimed responsibility and threatened another killing. In 2004, additional notes appeared around Fort Wayne, some involving young girls. Investigators believed these communications were connected to April's killer. The messages created fear in the community and gave detectives additional material to examine. They also demonstrated the offender's apparent confidence. For years, he had been able to communicate without exposing his identity. He could leave a note and disappear. He could provide clues without providing his name. But those communications also became part of the evidence investigators could examine after Miller was identified. The irony was striking. The killer appeared to believe that he controlled the investigation. Yet the traces he left behind became part of the historical record that eventually surrounded him. His communications did not protect him forever. His DNA did not protect him forever. Time did not protect him forever. Technology eventually connected the pieces. When Miller pleaded guilty in December 2018, the 30-year mystery entered a new stage of finality. He admitted to murder and child molestation and received an 80-year sentence. The case no longer required a jury to determine whether the evidence proved his guilt. His plea provided the legal conclusion. For April's family, that moment must have carried an extraordinary mixture of emotions. There was the knowledge that the man responsible was finally being punished. There was also the painful reality that the truth had arrived 30 years too late to save April. Justice can establish accountability, but it cannot reverse time. The sentence could not restore the child who had disappeared on Good Friday in 1988. It could not return the years her family had spent without answers. It could only recognize the crime and impose a consequence on the person responsible. That distinction is important when discussing cold cases. The phrase solved can sound final, but for families, the emotional reality is far more complicated. A case can be legally solved while grief remains permanent. The mystery may end, but the loss does not. April's family had to live with both realities at the same time. They finally knew who had killed her. They also knew that nothing could change what had happened. The investigation therefore became a story about accountability rather than restoration. The broader impact of the case extended beyond the courtroom. Genetic genealogy was becoming increasingly important in investigations involving unidentified remains, sexual assaults, and murders where DNA evidence had survived but conventional searches had failed. April's case demonstrated that the technology could work even when the offender had never been identified through traditional means. It showed that an investigator did not necessarily need a direct database match. A family connection could be enough to begin the search, but it also raised serious questions about privacy and the use of genetic information. The same technology that could bring justice to a murdered child could also reveal family relationships that individuals never expected law enforcement to examine. The success of genetic genealogy therefore created both opportunities and responsibilities. Investigators had to consider how such searches should be conducted and what safeguards should exist. The technology was powerful precisely because DNA contains so much information about relationships that power required careful use. April's case became part of the growing history of that debate, yet behind the scientific discussion was still the individual story. April was not a DNA profile. She was a child. She had a family. She had friends. She had a future that was never allowed to happen. The investigation began because people refused to let her disappearance become just another forgotten case. Detectives searched for her. Volunteers joined the search. Investigators preserved evidence. Years later, new detectives continued the work. The case survived because people kept returning to it. That persistence mattered. Technology provided the final key, but technology could not decide which case deserved another look. Human beings had to make that decision. They had to believe that an old case could still be solved. They had to recognize that evidence collected decades earlier might still contain answers. They had to be willing to use new tools when old methods failed. That combination of human determination and scientific advancement eventually changed everything. The story of April Tinsley, therefore, became more than a murder investigation. It became a demonstration of how justice can travel across time. A crime committed in 1988 was solved in 2018. A biological profile collected in one technological era was interpreted in another. A family that had waited through decades of uncertainty finally received an answer. And a man who had remained unidentified for 30 years was finally forced to confront the evidence that had followed him all that time. The case was no longer a mystery. The DNA had spoken. The family tree had pointed toward a suspect. The laboratory had confirmed the connection. The suspect had confessed. The court had delivered its sentence. Yet the most haunting lesson remained unchanged. The passage of time does not necessarily destroy the truth. Sometimes it only delays the moment when the truth becomes visible. The finality of John D. Milleres's guilty plea did not erase the questions that had surrounded April Tinsley's murder for 3 decades. Instead, it gave investigators, the community, and April's family an opportunity to look back at the case with a different understanding. For years, the investigation had appeared to be trapped in the past. The crime had happened in 1988. The suspect was unknown. Traditional investigative methods had failed to produce an arrest, yet the evidence had never stopped existing. It had simply been waiting for investigators to develop a way to read it differently. That distinction became the defining feature of April's case. The breakthrough was not created from nothing. It came from evidence that had survived from the original investigation and from investigators who refused to accept that an unidentified killer would remain unidentified forever. April's murder began as a local tragedy in Fort Wayne, Indiana. She was 8 years old when she disappeared on April 1st, SIL, 1988. Her disappearance triggered a massive search. Police and volunteers looked for her throughout the area. The search ended 3 days later when her body was discovered in a rural location approximately 20 miles from where she had vanished. The case immediately became a homicide investigation, but the identity of the killer remained unknown. Detectives worked through leads and interviewed people who might have information. A witness provided a description that contributed to a composite sketch. Investigators searched for vehicles, suspects, and possible connections, but the evidence did not produce the answer. The case slowly became one of those investigations in which every passing year seemed to make a solution less likely. Yet the case continued to generate disturbing developments. In 1990, a message was found on a barn near where April's body had been discovered. The message claimed responsibility for her death and threatened another murder. Investigators took the message seriously. It appeared to come from someone who knew details of the crime and wanted authorities to know that the person responsible was still capable of violence. Years later, in 2004, more communications appeared in Fort Wayne. Notes were left at homes and on bicycles belonging to young girls. Used condoms and Polaroid photographs accompanied some of the material. The communications referred to April. Investigators believe the person responsible for these messages was the same individual responsible for her murder. The case now had an unusual combination of evidence: a decades-old homicide, biological material, threatening communications, photographs, and an offender who appeared to be deliberately taunting the investigation. Yet even with all of that, investigators still lacked the one thing they needed most. They did not know his name. The FBI later became involved in a renewed investigation. Detectives reviewed old information, conducted interviews, and examined possible suspects. The investigation continued to search for a conventional DNA match, but the profile did not identify anyone through the databases available at the time. This was the problem that had kept the case frozen. The DNA could establish that the same biological profile was associated with the crime, but without a matching individual, investigators had nowhere to go. Then genetic genealogy offered a new route. The unidentified DNA profile could be examined for genetic relationships. Instead of asking whether the offender was already in a police database, investigators could ask whether someone related to him was in a genealogical database. That subtle change in strategy opened a completely new investigative door. The process involved tracing genetic connections and building family trees. Investigators gradually narrowed the possible family lines. Eventually, attention focused on John D. Miller. But the investigation did not end with that discovery. Detectives needed direct confirmation. They obtained discarded DNA associated with Miller. The laboratory comparison produced the match. The biological evidence from April's case was consistent with Miller's DNA. The 30-year mystery had finally been reduced to one identifiable person. Miller was arrested in July 2018. The arrest sent shock waves through Fort Wayne because of the extraordinary amount of time that had passed. April's murder had become part of the community's collective memory. Many people had grown up knowing her name. Some had assumed the killer would never be identified. Now, police were announcing that they believed they had found him. The investigation had finally crossed the line between an unsolved case and an active prosecution. Miller was questioned by investigators and made statements acknowledging his involvement. The evidence and the statements created a powerful case, but Miller initially pleaded not guilty, meaning that a trial remained possible. Prosecutors prepared to present the evidence. The defense would have had the opportunity to challenge it. A jury could have been asked to consider the DNA, the investigation, and Miller's statements. Instead, Miller changed his plea. In December 2018, he pleaded guilty to murder and child molestation. He was sentenced to 80 years in prison. The sentence brought legal closure to a case that had remained unresolved for 30 years. The significance of the guilty plea was enormous. Investigators no longer had to rely solely on forensic reconstruction. The defendant himself had accepted responsibility. The case had moved from uncertainty to certainty, but the science that made the arrest possible remained one of the most important aspects of the investigation. Genetic genealogy was still a relatively new tool in criminal investigations, and April's case helped demonstrate how powerful it could be. Traditional DNA databases depend on a direct match. If the offender's DNA has never been collected and entered into the system, the search can fail even when the forensic profile is perfect. Genetic genealogy works differently. It can identify relatives. Those relatives can provide the path toward the offender. In April's case, that path eventually led investigators to Miller. This method fundamentally changed the possibilities for cold case investigators. A case that had once been considered nearly impossible could become solvable if biological evidence existed. That did not mean every cold case would be solved. It meant that investigators had another tool to use when traditional searches reached their limits. April's case also demonstrated the importance of distinguishing between a genealogical lead and forensic proof. The genealogical investigation pointed toward Miller, but the direct DNA comparison was necessary to establish the biological connection. Investigators did not arrest him simply because a family tree suggested that he could be the offender. They obtained a sample and compared it with the forensic evidence. That scientific confirmation transformed the genealogical theory into a strong evidentiary link. The process illustrated how modern cold case investigations combine old and new methods. Genetic genealogy can narrow a search, but conventional police work remains necessary. Investigators still have to identify people, verify information, collect evidence, conduct interviews, and build a prosecutable case. Technology can open the door, but investigators still have to walk through it. April's case required both. It also required patience. 30 years is an extraordinary amount of time for a homicide investigation to remain unresolved. Detectives who worked the original case eventually retired. Others took their place. Files were reviewed. Leads were reconsidered. Technology changed, yet the central evidence remained. The eventual solution showed why law enforcement agencies preserve cold case files and biological evidence even when there appears to be little immediate hope. A case can look impossible today and become solvable tomorrow. The same evidence can have different value depending on the technology available to analyze it. In 1988, investigators could not have imagined the exact method that would eventually identify April's killer. In 2018, investigators could use genetic genealogy to search for a relationship that earlier detectives could never have found. That is the strange relationship between time and forensic science. Time can make an investigation harder because memories fade and witnesses disappear. But time can also bring new technology. It can expand databases. It can create new investigative methods. It can give scientists tools that did not exist when the crime occurred. April's case demonstrated both sides of that equation. The passage of time created enormous challenges, but it also allowed science to evolve. The case, therefore, became a reminder that a cold case is not necessarily a dead case. The evidence may still be alive. A DNA profile can remain usable. A photograph can preserve information. A note can reveal behavioral patterns. A family tree can connect generations of people. A laboratory can revisit evidence with technology that did not exist decades earlier. The investigation can change even when the crime itself cannot. For April's family, however, the science was never the real story. The real story was the child they lost. Every investigative breakthrough was ultimately meaningful because it brought the case closer to accountability for her death. The arrest brought the first major answer. The guilty plea brought another. The sentence provided the final legal consequence, but the grief remained. Justice cannot make a murdered child 8 years old again. It cannot restore the future that was lost. It can only establish who was responsible and impose a consequence. That is what happened in April's case. The unknown offender became John D. Miller. The suspect became a defendant. The defendant became a convicted murderer. The decades-long investigation finally